She walked into the wolf's den wearing chains they called a wedding dress, and none of them realized she had come to burn the whole empire down. 26-year-old Delilah Mercer stood at the altar of St. Gabriel Cathedral, while 200 of Chicago's most dangerous men laughed at the size of her hips, the plainness of her face, and the desperate silence of a woman sold to settle her father's debts. Nico Valenti didn't even look at her. To every person in that cathedral, she was nothing, a transaction dressed in white lace. But while they laughed, Delilah was already counting exits, memorizing faces, and calculating exactly how long it would take to destroy every single one of them. If you love stories about women who turn silence into power and patience into vengeance, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and stay until the very last word, because this story is just getting started. The wedding cake was 4 tiers of white fondant roses, and Delilah hated roses. She stood in the antechamber off the cathedral's main hall in a gown she had never chosen, wearing shoes that were half a size too small, and she pressed her thumbnail hard into the pad of her index finger just to feel something that was hers. The pain was small and sharp and clean. She focused on it like a compass needle. Through the carved wooden door, she could hear the guests settling into their pews. The low murmur of conversation carried the particular quality of people who believed they were among themselves, relaxed in their cruelty, unguarded in their contempt. She caught fragments. Heard her father was a complete disaster, gambled away $40 million before they finally cut him loose. She's not exactly what I'd call a prize. Nico doesn't care, it's just paperwork. Guy hasn't looked at a woman twice since Elena. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. A ripple of quiet respect. Then the conversation moved on. Delilah pressed her thumbnail deeper. She had done her research on Elena Valenti long before she'd set foot in this city. Nico's first wife. Dead 4 years, car accident on the Eisenhower Expressway during a February ice storm. No children. The official story was clean and terrible and final. Delilah had found 7 different versions of it across 5 different sources, and not one of them agreed on the details. She had flagged that inconsistency and filed it in the place in her mind where she kept things that might matter later. The door to the antechamber opened. A man in a dark suit looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had been sent to move a piece of furniture. "It's time," he said. Delilah smoothed the front of her dress with both palms. She picked up the small bouquet of white lilies that had been placed in her hands without anyone asking what she preferred. She walked through the door. The cathedral was full. That was the first thing. She had expected perhaps 50 people, a quiet, transactional ceremony with minimal witnesses. Instead, there were 200 people, maybe more, filling pews that stretched back nearly the length of a city block beneath vaulted stone ceilings and windows of colored glass that scattered fractured light across the congregation like something broken made beautiful. She understood immediately. This wasn't a wedding, it was a demonstration. Nico Valenti was showing the city that the debt had been collected, that the Mercer name, once respected, had been fully absorbed into his orbit. Every person in those pews was there to witness the transaction and carry the information back to whatever corner of Chicago's criminal infrastructure they represented. Delilah walked. She kept her chin level and her pace deliberate. She did not rush. She did not look at her feet. She scanned the pews with the same measured attention she gave to a new set of financial records, methodically, without emotion, cataloging what she saw. A man in a gray suit near the front, mid-50s, silver at the temples, posture of someone accustomed to deference. She recognized him from photographs. Silas Vescovi, consigliere to the Valenti family for 11 years. Reputation: brilliant, patient, loyal to the point of worship. 3 former rivals had called him the most dangerous man in Chicago and then quietly disappeared. 2 rows back, a younger man, late 30s, dark jacket, thick neck, a scar that ran from his left ear toward his jaw. Marco DeLuca, capo. Nico's enforcer and the man responsible for the particular kind of violence that never made it into police reports. He was watching Delilah's approach with the flat, assessing eyes of a man pricing livestock. She memorized both faces and moved on. At the altar, Nico Valenti stood with his back half turned to the aisle, speaking quietly to the man beside him. He finished his sentence, unhurried, unbothered by the entrance of his bride. before he turned to face her. He was 41 years old, dark hair going silver at the temples, the same as Silas, but worn differently. Not distinguished, just relentless, like the color had been wrung out by years of carrying something heavy. 6 feet, broad shoulders, the kind of build that came from a life that had required actual physical force at some point, and had never entirely let go of that requirement. His face was angular and closed, the face of a man who had learned very early that expressions were a form of information, and information was a form of vulnerability. He looked at her the way he might look at a contract. She met his gaze and held it. Something crossed his face, too quick to name, gone before it fully arrived. He looked away first. It was a small thing, and it meant nothing, she told herself. She told herself that firmly. The officiant began to speak. Delilah stood in her 2 small shoes and her roses she hated gown and listened to the words wash over her while she continued her catalog. She noted which of Nico's men were positioned near the doors. She noted the man in the back left corner who was not in a suit, dark clothes, working posture, scanning the room with professional attention. Security. Not local. The posture was military, or something adjacent to it, something trained and expensive. She noted the single empty pew near the middle right, reserved, marked, conspicuously vacant. No one had sat near it. She filed that away. "Do you take this man?" "I do," she said. Nico repeated the words a moment later. His voice was low and even and completely without feeling. He slid a ring onto her finger, platinum, simple, expensive, chosen by someone else, and she felt the metal cool against her skin and thought, clearly and without drama. This is a cage, and I've just locked myself inside it on purpose, and now I have to be very, very good at what comes next. The officiant pronounced them married. No one applauded. There was a smattering of polite professional acknowledgement from the pews, the kind of response you gave to a business announcement you were expected to acknowledge but not celebrate. Nico turned from the altar without kissing her. He walked up the aisle. She followed, 2 steps behind, the way you'd follow a man who hadn't decided yet whether you were useful or irrelevant. The reception was held in a private ballroom 3 blocks from the cathedral, inside a building that didn't have a sign on the front and had 3 different levels of security between the street entrance and the event space. The room was beautiful in the way that expensive, impersonal spaces were beautiful. Correctly lit, correctly decorated, correctly catered, completely without warmth. Delilah ate almost nothing. She moved through the room and she listened. In 4 hours, she collected the following: the name of the shipping company that the Valenti family used for its legitimate logistics operations, 2 references to a property dispute in the River North district that had apparently caused friction between Nico and someone called the Bianchi brothers, the fact that Silas Vescovi had recently returned from a trip to New York that he had not mentioned to Nico directly, and the phone number of a woman named Rosaria who worked in the Valenti estate's household and who was, based on 30 seconds of conversation at the dessert table, profoundly unhappy with her current employment situation. By the time Nico appeared beside her and said, "We're leaving," she had learned more about his operation than most men in that room knew after years of service. She smiled at him pleasantly. "Of course," she said. The car ride to the estate took 40 minutes. They did not speak. Nico spent it on his phone, typing with his thumbs, occasionally glancing out the window with the expression of a man whose mind was somewhere else and had been for a long time. Delilah looked out the opposite window and watched the city pass and thought about everything she had collected and how each piece connected to the others and where the gaps were. The Valenti estate sat behind its own walls on the city's northwest edge. Not suburban, not quite urban. The kind of location that had been chosen for defensibility first and aesthetics second. The grounds were large, the house itself was vast, and the whole compound had the well-maintained, tastefully decorated quality of a place run by competent staff who had learned to anticipate needs without being asked. The housekeeper, a woman named Mrs. Cantello, who appeared to be in her 60s and had the bone structure of someone who had once been striking and now had simply become formidable, met them at the front door with a key and a practiced expression of welcome. "Mr. Valenti, your wife's rooms have been prepared on the east wing, 2nd floor." "Good," Nico said, and walked past her without stopping. Delilah stood in the entrance hall and watched him go. He took the stairs at the center of the hall, turned left at the top, and disappeared down a corridor that led, she noted, to the opposite wing from the one she'd been assigned. "This way, Mrs. Valenti," Mrs. Cantello said. The name landed on her like a hand on the shoulder. Unexpected, possessive, uncomfortable. She followed the housekeeper upstairs, was shown a suite of rooms that were gracious and complete and utterly impersonal, was informed about the household schedule and the location of relevant amenities, and was left alone. She sat on the edge of the bed in her wedding dress and looked at the walls. She had known this was how it would be. She had planned for this. Isolation was not a complication. Isolation was an advantage, because isolated women were not watched carefully, and women who were not watched carefully were free to do a great many things that mattered. She reached into the bodice of her dress and removed a small device, no larger than a thumb drive, matte black, the product of a careful purchase made 6 weeks ago through a channel that could not be traced back to her. She turned it over in her fingers. Her father, Thomas Mercer, had been many things: a drunk, a gambler, a man whose brilliance had been slowly dismantled by his own worst impulses until there was nothing left but debt and wreckage. He had spent the last decade of his life selling pieces of himself, his reputation, his relationships, his financial expertise, to men who used those pieces and discarded them when they were done. But before all of that, before the addiction had taken root and the losses had compounded and the man had collapsed inward under the weight of his own failures, before all of that, Thomas Mercer had been the most gifted financial forensics analyst in the Midwest. He had worked for 3 federal agencies, 2 private investigation firms, and 1 law office that had used his skills to dismantle the hidden assets of 4 different organized crime families over a 12-year career. He had taught Delilah everything, not because he had planned to, not as a deliberate education, but because Thomas Mercer had been, even in his degradation, a man who loved to talk about the one thing he had genuinely understood: the hidden language of money, the way wealth moved through systems and left traces, the techniques for following those traces back to their sources, the ways that clever men tried to obscure what they owned, and how those obscuring techniques inevitably created their own signatures. By the time she was 16, Delilah had understood more about financial forensics than most professionals learned in a decade of practice. By 20, she had developed her own methods, her own frameworks. By 26, sitting on the edge of a bed in the east wing of the Valenti estate in a dress that didn't belong to her, she was, without question or contest, one of the most capable financial investigators in the country. She was also completely invisible to everyone who might have posed a threat to that capability. Because she was fat and plain and quiet, and she had arrived here as a debt payment, and nobody worried about furniture. She set the device on the nightstand. She reached behind her to find the zipper of her dress. She stood up, stepped out of it, hung it carefully over the back of the vanity chair. Not because she cared about the dress, but because careless people left traces, and she was never careless. And she changed into the clothes she found folded in the dresser. Plain, functional. Someone had stocked the rooms with appropriate items. Someone who hadn't met her and so had guessed wrong about nearly everything. The clothes were a size too small, and the colors were wrong for her complexion, and none of that mattered at all. She sat cross-legged on the bed with the device in her lap and thought carefully about sequencing. First, the network. She needed to understand the estate's digital infrastructure before she touched anything that could be detected. That meant patience. That meant days, possibly weeks, of passive observation before any active probing. She had done this before in controlled environments. The scale was larger here. The stakes were different, but the methodology was the same. Second, the financial picture. She had fragments already from the reception: names, company names, a property dispute, a trip to New York. Each fragment was a thread. She needed to locate the fabric those threads belonged to before she started pulling. Third, the personal picture. Nico Valenti was the hub around which everything else rotated. To understand the empire, she had to understand him, not his reputation, not the stories told about him in the pews of that cathedral, but the actual man, the patterns, the gaps, the places where the controlled exterior had stress fractures running through it. She thought about the empty pew. She thought about the name Elena, dropped into conversation and collected with quiet reverence. She thought about the way Nico had turned from the altar without kissing her, the set of his shoulders as he walked away, the particular quality of a man who had decided not to feel something and was very accomplished at maintaining that decision. She filed it all carefully and told herself it didn't matter. Then she turned off the light and lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her, and told herself again, more firmly, that the man she had married was a target, not a person, and that the difference between those two things was the only thing that was going to keep her safe. She almost believed herself. 3 weeks passed. She was, by the end of those 3 weeks, completely fluent in the rhythms of the Valenti estate. She knew that Mrs. Cantello arrived each morning at 5:45 and that the security rotation changed at 6, noon, and midnight. She knew that the 2 men stationed at the east gate preferred the coffee from the kitchen over the coffee from the security booth, and that this preference caused a 7-minute window each morning when the booth camera's blind spot was unmonitored. She knew that the housekeeper's assistant, a young woman named Petra, who cleaned the second-floor corridor on Tuesdays and Thursdays, had a habit of leaving the door to the linen closet propped open when she worked, and that the linen closet shared a ventilation shaft with the room Nico used as his private office. She had not accessed the office. Not yet. She was learning the house first, the way it breathed, the way it moved, the way its inhabitants behaved when they believed they were unobserved. She had also been learning Nico. He was in the house, on average, 3 days out of 7. He arrived and departed at irregular hours, accompanied by varying numbers of men, depending on the nature of his business, but always accompanied by at least 2. He ate breakfast alone when he was home, in the kitchen rather than the formal dining room, standing at the counter rather than sitting at the table, with coffee and whatever Mrs. Cantello had prepared, which he consumed with the mechanical efficiency of someone fueling a machine rather than tasting a meal. He came to the East Wing once, on the 4th day of the marriage, and knocked on the door to her sitting room with 3 precise raps. She had been sitting in the chair by the window with a book, a novel, deliberately chosen to look like exactly what it appeared to be, and she looked up when he entered and said nothing. He looked at her for a moment with that appraising, closed expression. "I need to know if you have any—" He stopped, tried again. "There are arrangements that need to be made. Financial accounts, credit accounts, for your use." "That's very kind," she said. "It's not kindness. It's maintenance." He said it without cruelty, just flatly, factually. A man who had stopped bothering to sand the edges off his meaning. "Mrs. Cantello will give you the account information tomorrow. If you need anything for the house, anything for yourself, use those accounts. Keep the receipts." "Of course," she said. He turned to leave. "Nico," she said. He stopped. "The property in River North," she said. "The dispute with the Bianchi family. I heard something at the reception that might be useful, if you'd like to hear it." A long pause. He turned back around slowly, and for the first time since the altar, he looked at her with something other than the assessing blankness he'd been carrying. It was not warmth, but it was attention. "What did you hear?" he said. "The Bianchis are leveraged, significantly. They took a bridge loan from a private lender in the 3rd quarter of last year to cover operating costs on 3 of their commercial properties. The lender is calling the note in 90 days. She tilted her head slightly. "If you move on the River North property before the note comes due, you're competing against a family with resources. If you wait 60 days, you're negotiating with a family that is functionally insolvent." Another pause, longer this time. "Who told you that?" he said. It wasn't a question. "Nobody told me anything," she said. "I listened, and I know how to read what I hear." He looked at her for another moment. The same appraising quality, but with something added now, something she couldn't quite classify. Then he nodded once, very slightly, the way you'd acknowledge the fact of something you hadn't expected to encounter, and left without another word. She returned to her book. Her hands were completely steady. She was proud of that. On day 22, she found the first anomaly. She had been working patiently through the digital infrastructure for nearly 2 weeks by then, careful, methodical, leaving no fingerprints, using techniques her father had developed for tracing money through layered systems. She had mapped the Valenti organization's legitimate business structure, the logistics company, the real estate holdings, the restaurant chain that operated in 4 Chicago neighborhoods, the security consulting firm that represented the public-facing edge of operations that were anything but consulting. Legitimate on the surface, structurally sound, well-managed. Someone had put serious effort into making the financial architecture of the Valenti empire bulletproof. But there was a gap, not a dramatic gap, not the kind of obvious inconsistency that a careless man would leave. This was subtle, a fractional timing discrepancy between two intercompany transfers that should have moved on the same processing schedule and didn't, off by 4 hours. The kind of thing that could be a clerical error, a system lag, 100 innocuous explanations. Except that Delilah had been looking at financial records for more than a decade, and the pattern of the discrepancy wasn't consistent with any of those innocuous explanations. The pattern was consistent with a manual intervention. Someone had touched the timing on that transfer, deliberately, and had been very good about covering it. Not quite good enough. She followed the thread. It took her 6 more days to understand what she was seeing, and when she understood it, she sat back from her screen in the quiet of the East Wing sitting room at 2 in the morning and felt something cold move through her chest. Someone was bleeding the Valenti operation. Not stealing outright, nothing that crude, nothing that detectable. This was sophisticated. A series of fractional diversions spread across dozens of transactions, each one individually meaningless, collectively representing, over the period she could currently trace, something in the range of $11 million rerouted through a chain of shell entities to a destination she hadn't yet identified. 11 million, over 18 months. And based on the infrastructure she could see, this had been designed to continue indefinitely. She thought about Silas Vescovi returning from New York without mentioning the trip to Nico. She thought about Marco De Luca's flat livestock pricing eyes during the wedding procession. She thought about the particular quality of a man who was loyal to another man, and the particular different quality of a man who was performing loyalty while building a separate future. She thought coup. She thought timeline. She thought, Nico is going to die, and nobody around him can see it coming, and the only person in this entire situation who has any idea what is actually happening is a woman locked in an East Wing suite who is supposed to be furniture. She sat with that for a long time. She should tell him. That was the logical, direct response. Bring him the evidence, explain what she'd found, let him handle it through whatever mechanisms a man like Nico Valenti used to handle betrayal. Except he hadn't listened at the reception when she'd offered the Bianchi intelligence. He'd taken it eventually, but he'd approached it with the particular resistance of a man who found the source of information insulting, regardless of the information's quality. And that had been a small thing, a local property dispute. This was different. This was telling a man that his most trusted lieutenant and his most capable enforcer were planning his murder, and the man she was telling had spent 41 years in a world where information was a weapon, and the person delivering it was always considered a potential threat. He would question her motive. He would question her method. He would want to know how she'd gotten access to financial systems she wasn't supposed to know existed. And in the time it took him to decide whether to trust her, the people she was warning him about would notice that something had shifted, and the timeline would accelerate, and Nico would end up dead faster than the coup's original schedule called for. She knew that. She understood it in the clear, unsentimental way she understood financial systems, by recognizing that the components interacted predictably according to their nature, and that her intervention had to be timed to the system's rhythms, not to her own comfort. So she needed more evidence, a clearer picture of the destination for those $11 million. The identity of whoever in New York was connected to Silas's unannounced trip, the specific trigger condition for the assassination attempt, because there would be one. Men like Silas and Marco didn't move against a target as formidable as Nico without a contained environment, a controlled situation, a moment when his defenses were down and they could be certain of the outcome. She needed to find that moment before they used it. She needed to be in position before they moved. She went back to work. 2 days later, she was in the kitchen at 6:15 in the morning, early enough that the security rotation had just changed. Mrs. Cantello was in the East Wing beginning her morning rounds. Petra hadn't arrived yet, when Nico walked in. He stopped in the doorway when he saw her. She was standing at the counter with coffee and the morning feed from 4 financial news sources she'd configured to pull overnight data. She was not, she realized, dressed for a performance. She was wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt and reading glasses, and her hair was in a knot she'd put up at 4 in the morning when she'd finally gone to bed. This was, she thought with a detached internal accuracy, probably the most authentically herself she'd looked since arriving here. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep." She moved to get out of his way. "Don't." He crossed to the coffee machine. "You were here first." She stayed. They stood in the kitchen in the early morning quiet, and he poured coffee and she read her screen, and for 5 minutes neither of them said anything. It was not comfortable exactly, but it was something other than the performing furniture dynamic she'd been navigating for 3 weeks. It was two people existing in a space without the elaborate machinery of pretense running at full capacity. He refilled his cup before asking, "Did you follow up on the Bianchi thing? I pulled the public records on the loan. The terms are worse than I initially thought. They're not just leveraged. The lender has a clause that accelerates the call date if 3 criteria are met, and they currently meet 2 of them. The third will probably trigger in the next 30 to 45 days based on their current cash flow patterns." He was quiet. "That means your window is shorter than I said the other night," she said. "How do you know their cash flow patterns?" "I don't know them. I estimated them based on available public information and the characteristics of similar operations at similar debt-to-revenue ratios." She paused. "I could be wrong." "But you don't think you are?" "No," she said. "I don't." He looked at her over the rim of his cup. "What did your father do exactly? Before the addiction? Before the collapse? Before the 40 million in gambling debts that had delivered his daughter to the altar of a cathedral like a payment rendered in human currency?" She heard all of that in the question, not asked, but present. "Financial forensics," she said. "He worked for people who needed to find money that other people were trying to hide. And he taught you." "He talked," she said. "I listened." Nico set his cup down. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she'd classified as unclassifiable, the one that kept appearing when she said something that didn't fit his existing model of who she was. "The account information Mrs. Cantello gave you," he said. "Have you used any of it?" "Not yet." "Why not?" "I haven't needed anything. Women in your situation usually—" He stopped. Started differently. "Most people in a new situation find things to want, things to establish themselves. Territory." "I'm not interested in territory," she said. "I'm interested in utility." "Utility. Whether I'm useful here." She met his eyes directly. "Whether there are things I can actually do for this situation, or whether I'm just an expensive piece of furniture in the East Wing." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one had weight in it. "The River North property," he said finally. "If you were advising on timing, what would you do?" "Make a preliminary approach now," she said immediately. "Not an offer. An approach. Let the Bianchis know you're interested. Let them calculate what your interest means for their leverage position. When the third criterion triggers on their loan and they understand the lender is going to call the note, they'll come to you. And you'll negotiate from a position of complete advantage. You make it sound simple. It is simple," she said. "It's just math with people attached to it." Something very nearly like a smile crossed the edge of his face. Not quite, but close enough that she registered it and filed it away in the place where she kept things that might matter later. She was getting increasingly concerned about the size of that particular file. It was on the 34th day of her marriage that she found the destination account. She had been following the diverted funds through a chain of 6 shell entities, carefully, slowly, covering her tracks with the meticulousness of someone who understood that detection at this stage would end her operational window entirely. The chain had been designed with skill. 3 jurisdictions, 2 naming conventions, 1 entity that appeared on paper to belong to a legitimate import-export business with a clean audit history. She had spent 4 days on that import-export business alone, because it had been built very well, and she had wanted to be certain she hadn't misread it. She hadn't. The business was a shell. The audit history was fabricated, well, not badly, but with a specific technique that she had seen before years ago in records her father had brought home from a federal investigation that had ultimately stalled and never been pursued. She recognized the technique because her father had recognized it, had called it a Russian nesting doll, layers of legitimate-looking documentation that each contained a smaller, more concealed fraudulent layer inside it, and had spent an entire dinner explaining to a 14-year-old Delilah why it was elegant and why it was traceable and exactly where the traceability breakpoints were. She found the breakpoint. The money was landing in 2 accounts. One was registered to an entity she didn't recognize, recent, clean, dormant prior to 8 months ago. The other she did recognize. She had to sit with that for a while. The second account was connected through 2 degrees of shell documentation to a company that had been identified in a 3-year-old federal investigation. An investigation that had been abruptly dropped when a key witness had changed his testimony as a logistics front for weapons transport. Not drug transport, weapons. The scale of the imports logged through that company's records, combined with the 11 million being funneled from Valenti operations, suggested a procurement operation. Someone was buying hardware. Significant hardware. The kind of hardware you purchased when you were planning not just a change in leadership, but a complete restructuring of the territorial landscape. Silas and Marco weren't just planning to kill Nico. They were planning to take Chicago apart and rebuild it. And they were almost ready to do it. She looked at the screen for a long moment. She thought about Nico standing in the kitchen with his coffee, almost smiling at the Bianchi analysis. She thought about the empty pew at the wedding. She thought about Elena Valenti's car accident and the 7 versions of the story and all the inconsistencies she'd filed for later. She thought, I have been here for 34 days and I am not furniture, but I am alone. And the man I'm trying to help will not believe me until it's too late unless I give him something he cannot argue with. She was good at preparing for arguments. She started building the file. 3 nights later, she was in the linen closet with the ventilation shaft open when she heard Silas's voice in the office below. She had known he was in the house. She'd seen his car on the security feed she'd quietly redirected to her tablet 2 weeks ago. She had positioned herself in the closet because she was methodical, and because she didn't like loose ends, and because the voice in the shaft would be cleaner than the audio she'd been pulling from the office's HVAC sensor. She pressed herself against the wall and listened. Sooner than we planned. Silas's voice, stripped of the polished respect she'd seen him perform at the wedding. Lower, harder, the voice of the actual man underneath the performance. Nico's voice, responding, What's changed? New York is pushing the timeline. They want resolution before the end of the month. A pause. That's aggressive. They're concerned about exposure. The longer this... Silas stopped. The longer the current situation continues, the more opportunity for complications. She heard what Nico didn't hear, not because she was smarter than him, but because she was listening to Silas and Nico was not. Silas was speaking about Nico's death as the current situation. Nico was speaking about some external problem, different conversation, same room, same words. The cold thing moved through her chest again. I'll be at the Meridian property Friday night, Nico said. Final walkthrough before we close. Of course, Silas said, and something in his voice shifted, the particular quality of a man who has just been handed the specific information he needed. I'll make sure everything is prepared. She stayed in the closet for 3 full minutes after she heard them leave the office. She breathed slowly. She thought about Friday. She calculated the days. 2 days. She had 2 days. She went back to her room and she sat in the dark and she thought about what she was going to do. And she thought about the risks of each option, and she thought about the very real possibility that none of her options were clean, that every path forward carried significant probability of failure, and that failure in this specific context meant not a setback, but a death, possibly hers, possibly his, possibly both. She thought about that for a long time. Then she pulled out the phone she'd purchased in cash from a convenience store on the day she'd arrived in Chicago, the one she'd never connected to any network traceable to this house. And she made 3 calls to 3 different people whose services she had identified weeks ago as potentially necessary. Then she went to the garage and located the vehicle she needed. Then she went back to her room and she lay down and she closed her eyes and she ran through the plan until the variables were as controlled as they were going to get. She did not sleep. Friday came gray and cold, a November sky pressing down over the lake, the kind of weather that made Chicago feel like a machine rather than a city, all steel and concrete and indifferent wind. Delilah stood at her window and watched Nico's convoy leave the estate at 7 in the evening. 2 vehicles, 4 men, standard departure protocol. She had been monitoring the Meridian property, an abandoned industrial building on the river's south branch that was, ostensibly, a future development site, for the past 40 hours using a combination of feeds she'd quietly accessed and a very expensive hour of contractor time from one of the 3 people she'd called 2 nights ago. What the monitoring had shown was not a development walkthrough. It was a staging ground. 8 men had arrived at the Meridian property between 9 in the morning and 6 in the evening. 4 vehicles, parked inside the building, not visible from the street. 2 of those vehicles she'd run against the contractor's intel and confirmed were registered to a security firm that had no actual clients, but had been incorporated 3 months ago with seed capital that she could trace, through familiar methods, back to the same weapon procurement chain she'd identified weeks earlier. Silas and Marco had built themselves a private army, and Nico was driving directly into the middle of it. She watched his convoy's taillights disappear at the estate gate. She waited 4 minutes, enough time to clear the immediate neighborhood. Then she went to the garage. The armored SUV was registered to the estate's security fleet. She had spent 45 minutes over the past 2 days ensuring she understood its operational characteristics: weight, turning radius, acceleration curve, the specific behavior of the reinforced chassis under impact loading. She had driven vehicles with similar profiles before, in a different context, in a different city, a chapter of her life that almost nobody in Chicago knew about, and that she had never considered a liability until this moment, when it became instead an asset. She got in. She drove. The Meridian building was 17 minutes from the estate at legal speeds. She did not drive at legal speeds. She killed her headlights 4 blocks out and switched to the thermal feed from the device she'd had her contractor install on the building's exterior. 12 heat signatures inside, not 8. They'd added more men since the last sweep. She thought, this is worse than I planned for. She drove anyway. The building's east loading door was the entry point she'd selected. The widest clearance, the angle that minimized her exposure during the approach, the position that placed the SUV between Nico and the highest concentration of threat signatures she could see on the feed. She heard the gunshots when she was still half a block out. Her hands tightened on the wheel and she thought, he's already in there and they've already started and I am possibly too late. She pressed the accelerator to the floor. The loading door was reinforced industrial steel, and it gave way under the SUV's chassis with a sound like the city itself cracking open. A catastrophic, enormous noise that filled the building and swallowed everything else for half a second. And in that half second, she was already through the door, and the emergency systems were triggering, and red light was flooding the space, and she was reading the heat signatures and triangulating position, and she saw him, one figure, lower than the others, behind a cluster of steel crates on the northeast wall. 2 signatures closing on his left, 3 more on his right. She drifted the SUV across the wet concrete floor. She knew how to drift. She had learned it under circumstances that were arguably worse than these, which was the kind of fact about herself that she had long since accepted without analysis. The vehicle stopped. She reached across the console and pushed the passenger door open. She could see him through the windshield now. Blood on his jacket, torn at the shoulder, face carrying the specific expression of a man who has calculated his options and found all of them insufficient. His eyes found the SUV. They found her face. She watched him process it. She watched the calculation happen in real time. The disbelief, the rapid recalibration, the moment where the man who had never once looked at her as anything other than furniture understood that the furniture had driven a battering ram into an assassination in progress. "Get in," she said. He got in. She had the SUV moving before he finished closing the door, cutting hard right, back toward the loading bay. 3 of the heat signatures moving to intercept and 2 rounds hitting the rear quarter panel with dull, useless impacts against reinforced steel. And then they were through the opening and into the cold Chicago night, and she was accelerating through a gap in the traffic on the service road with the kind of controlled aggression that came from knowing exactly what the vehicle under you was capable of. 2 blocks. 3. She ran the red at the intersection without slowing and made the left onto the feeder road that would bring them out near the river access. And she didn't speak because she was navigating and she needed all of it right now. All of her attention on the variables, the distance, the follow vehicles she could see in the mirror, 1 pursuit vehicle. She'd anticipated 2. She thought, one of Silas's men must have gotten to the other car first. She filed that under complicating factors and kept driving. 5 minutes. She pushed them through a sequence of turns she'd pre-planned, through an industrial district where the street grid was inconsistent and the camera coverage was minimal. And when she finally straightened out onto a clear run and confirmed the pursuit vehicle had lost them in the turns, she let her breathing decelerate. Nico had not spoken since he'd gotten in the car. She drove for another 2 minutes in silence before she pulled into a parking structure and killed the engine on the third level, in the darkest corner, where no camera had line of sight. She sat with her hands on the wheel for a moment. Then she said, "Your consigliere and your capo have been diverting funds from your operation for at least 18 months. The total I can currently trace is $11 million, but I believe the actual figure is significantly higher. The money has been going into a weapons procurement chain. I have documentation for all of it." She paused. "They've also been coordinating with a contact in New York who I haven't fully identified yet, but I have enough of the financial trail to make identification possible within the next 24 hours. He was very still. "Tonight wasn't spontaneous," she said. "They selected the Meridian property because it gave them a controlled environment with no witnesses and because it's in a blind spot between two different jurisdictions, which would have complicated the investigation. They've been planning this for months." She looked at him. "You have a bleeding wound on your left shoulder that is not serious but needs to be addressed. There's a first aid kit in the back." He turned his head toward her very slowly. The expression on his face was not one she'd seen from him before. It was not the assessing blankness. It was not the near smile. It was something raw and unguarded. The expression of a man whose entire model of the world has just been revised in the span of 7 minutes, and who has not yet had time to build a new one. "How long?" he said. The words came out rough, stripped down. "How long have you known?" 11 days, she said. "I needed to be certain before I came to you." "You should have—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "You wouldn't have believed me," she said. "You would have wondered why I had access to information I wasn't supposed to have. And while you were deciding whether to trust me, they would have moved the timeline forward." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it. The sequence, the logic, the uncomfortable recognition that she was right. "Get the first aid kit," she said. "We have work to do." He opened his mouth, closed it. Something shifted in his face. Not resolution, not quite, but the first fracture in the wall he'd been standing behind since the altar. "Who are you?" he said. Not an accusation. Not a challenge. A genuine question. The question of a man who has realized that the woman sitting next to him is not who he thought she was, and that this revelation is either the best thing that has ever happened to him or the most dangerous. She held his eyes. "I'm your wife," she said. And then, before he could respond, before he could process it or argue with it or decide what it meant, her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. It was a message from one of her contractors. 4 words. "Silas knows you're alive." The phone sat between them in the dark of the parking structure like a live grenade. Neither of them had armed, but both of them could see. "Silas knows you're alive." 4 words. Delilah read them twice, not because she didn't understand them the first time, but because she was giving herself exactly 2 seconds to absorb the implication before she shifted into response mode. 2 seconds was what she allowed herself. Emotion on a delay. Process first. Nico had read the screen over her shoulder. She felt the change in him before she saw it. The particular tension of a man whose body remembers violence, the way other men remember music. Every muscle going taut, the breath changing, the stillness becoming something predatory rather than passive. "Who sent that?" he said. "A contractor I hired." She was already typing back a response. He was monitoring communications on the Meridian frequency. "You hired a contractor. 3 of them." She hit send. "I needed eyes I could trust." The silence that followed had a specific texture. The silence of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood, working backward through the past 34 days and finding a different picture than the one he'd been looking at. She could almost feel him doing it, the mental dismantling and reconstruction, piece by piece. "You've been running your own operation," he said, "inside my house." "Yes." "For how long?" "Since the night we arrived." He said nothing. She kept her eyes on the phone, waiting for her contractor's reply, but she was tracking him in her peripheral vision the way she tracked everything, steady, cataloging, ready to adjust. "That's either very impressive," he said slowly, "or it's the most dangerous thing anyone has ever done under my roof. Both can be true, and be..." His response to that was a short, exhaled sound. Not a laugh exactly, but something in the same family. The sound of a man who has just had something true said to him in a context where truth has been scarce for a long time. Her phone buzzed. She read the message. Silas has been in contact with someone in the last 20 minutes. My contractor is working on the intercept. He says, she paused, parsing the shorthand. He says the signal originated from inside the building, which means someone at Meridian survived and reported back before we cleared the area. Of course they did. Nico's voice had gone flat in a specific way. The flatness of a man who is angry and is managing it as a tactical problem rather than an emotional one. How many of those men tonight were mine? She looked at him. How many of them, he said again, harder, were supposed to be my people? At least 3 of the signatures I tracked were registered to your security payroll, she said carefully. The others were outside contractors. He turned his head toward the windshield. The line of his jaw was rigid. She watched him absorb that. Not just the betrayal of Silas and Marco, which he'd had 7 minutes to begin processing, but the deeper contamination of it. The men around him. The men he'd eaten breakfast near and walked past in corridors and trusted with proximity to his body. Some number of those men had already chosen the other side. Where can we go? He said. The phrasing was deliberate, she noticed. Not where can I go? Not where can you take me? We. She had thought about this. She had thought about this 11 days ago when she'd first begun to understand what she was looking at, had run the options with the same methodical attention she gave to every variable, and had identified 3 possible safe locations ranked by security profile, accessibility, and probability of compromise. I have a space, she said, off the grid, not connected to you or to me in any documented way. Whose name is it in? Someone who doesn't exist anymore. He turned to look at her. It's clean, she said. I promise you it's clean. He held her eyes for a moment. That process happening again, the evaluation, the friction between what he'd believed about her and what the past hour had demonstrated. She held the eye contact without flinching. Drive, he said. She drove. The space was a 3rd-floor unit in a converted warehouse building in Pilsen, purchased 18 months ago under a corporate entity she'd built from the ground up using techniques her father had taught her, techniques she'd refined over years, specifically for the purpose of maintaining operational infrastructure that couldn't be traced back to its owner. She'd never told anyone about it. She'd furnished it minimally, a bed, a work table, a secure internet terminal, enough food and medical supplies to sustain 2 people for 2 weeks if it came to that. It had come to that. She got them inside and locked the door and turned on exactly 1 lamp, low wattage, positioned away from the windows. And she said, sit down. And Nico, for the 2nd time that night, did what she told him. She got the first aid kit and she sat across from him and she looked at the shoulder wound with the unsentimental assessment she'd learned from a field medic in a context she was not going to explain right now. The bullet had grazed the muscle, significant but not structural. It had bled substantially and was still seeping. She cleaned it with the thoroughness of someone who understood that a wound infection in this situation was not an inconvenience but a timeline problem. He held still while she worked. She noticed that. A man who trusted his own body, who wasn't frightened of pain, who understood the difference between discomfort and damage, and was not going to perform suffering over the former. You need to tell me everything, he said, while she pressed gauze against the entry point with firm, even pressure. His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it. Not fear, she thought. Something rawer than fear. The specific strain of a man whose fundamental understanding of the people around him has just been destroyed. All of it, from the beginning. So she told him. She told him about the first anomaly on day 22, the timing discrepancy, the fractional diversion, the chain of shell entities leading to the weapons procurement account. She told him about the Russian nesting doll technique and how she'd recognized it. She told him about the $11 million and the weapons chain and the private army that had been staged at Meridian. She told him about Silas returning from New York without mentioning it and what she'd overheard in the ventilation shaft and how she'd understood what Silas was saying to him in that office when Nico himself had not. She told him all of it in clean, sequential order, with the specific and unglamorous detail of someone presenting evidence rather than a story. He listened without interrupting. She gave him credit for that. When she finished, the silence was very different from the parking structure silence. This one had weight and texture, and a quality she had not anticipated, something that felt, in its density, almost like grief. Not for himself. Something else. "Silas has been with me for 11 years, he said. She didn't answer. There was nothing to answer. It was not a statement that wanted a response. It was a man saying something out loud that he had to say out loud in order to understand it as true. 11 years. He looked at his hands. The right one, the one that was clean, resting on his knee with the particular stillness of a man who is very carefully not making a fist. I would have... He stopped. I know, she said. He looked at her sharply. Don't. I wasn't... Don't tell me what you know about what I would have done. The edge in his voice was real, not cruelty, but something that came from the same place cruelty could come from. The raw, exposed underside of a confidence that had just been gutted. You don't know me. You're right, she said simply. He seemed to expect an argument. The absence of one shifted something in the room. He exhaled slowly and looked back at his hands. The money, he said. You said 11 million. That's what I can trace. The actual figure is higher. I'm confident of that, but I need more time with the records to establish the full amount. How much higher? Significantly. Possibly 3 or 4 times that. He was quiet for a moment. And the weapons. The procurement chain has been active for approximately 8 months. The scale of the imports, matched against typical acquisition costs for the hardware type involved, suggests they were building capacity for a significant territorial restructuring. Not just removing you, but rebuilding Chicago underneath your removal. With New York's backing. That's my read of the Silas trip, yes. Someone in New York wanted this done and was willing to fund part of the infrastructure, which tells you something about who in New York it is. He looked at her. Whoever it is had enough capital to seed this operation and enough motive to want Chicago under different management, she said. That narrows the field considerably. I can have a name for you in 24 hours if I have access to the right records. What records? The secondary account I traced. There's a New York registration trail behind it that I was 24 hours from following when tonight's timeline moved. He studied her for a moment. Something in his expression had changed over the course of the conversation. Not softened, that wasn't the word. Focused. He was looking at her the way he probably looked at things that mattered, with the complete, undivided attention of a man who had simply not been directing it toward her before. You said you needed to be certain before you came to me, he said. 11 days ago. Yes. And you spent 11 days building a file. Yes. While you were also running an off-book contractor operation, monitoring my communications, maintaining this location. He paused. Is there anything else I don't know about? She thought about the phone she'd never connected to the estate network. She thought about the 4 other contingency measures she'd built into the operational plan over the past month. She thought about the very specific file she'd compiled on Elena Valenti's accident that she hadn't mentioned yet because it wasn't relevant to the immediate threat and because she was going to need to choose the right moment for it. Nothing that affects the current situation, she said. His eyes narrowed slightly. I'll tell you everything, she said, when we have time. Right now the priority is Silas knowing you're alive and the 24-hour window I need to close the New York identification. A long pause. He made a decision. She could see it, the specific quality of a man who has learned to make decisions quickly and live with them rather than turn them over indefinitely. What do you need? He said. My equipment from the estate. There's a drive in the back of the 3rd drawer of my vanity that has everything I've compiled so far. I need it here, and I need it in the next 3 hours. I can get it. Not you, she said quickly. If Silas is monitoring your known locations, the estate will be watched. I need someone who isn't on your current security payroll, someone whose connection to you isn't documented. He looked at her. And you have someone like that. I have a contractor who hasn't been burned. Your invisible army, he said, with the particular tone of someone who is both impressed and deeply unsettled. One person, she said. Not an army. Yet, he said. She didn't answer that. He pulled out his phone, not the one she'd seen him use at the estate, she noticed. A second phone, which meant he kept the same kind of operational redundancy she did, which was either reassuring or the most interesting thing she'd learned about him all month, and she wasn't sure which. There are 3 men I trust completely, he said. Not on Silas's chain of contact, not on Marco's, men who answer directly to me and nobody else. How certain are you? The look he gave her then was complicated, acknowledging in its complexity that his certainty about Silas had been absolute 2 hours ago, and that his certainty about anything was currently worth a fraction of what it had been. As certain as I can be, he said, which is not a comfortable answer. No, he said, it's not. They looked at each other across the dim room, and she felt, for the first time since arriving in this city, that they were in the same position, both exposed, both working from incomplete information, both understanding that the space between trust and catastrophic error was very, very thin. Tell me about Silas, she said. Not the professional picture, the personal one. Things that won't be in records. Something moved in his face. Why? Because I need to understand his motive at the psychological level. Financial evidence tells me what he did. It doesn't tell me why he decided it was worth doing, and the why is going to matter when we move against him. Nico set the phone down on the table. He leaned back and he looked at the ceiling for a moment. The posture of a man dredging something up from a depth he doesn't usually access. Silas has been building towards something for a long time, he said. I knew that. I thought I knew what it was. More influence, more formal authority in the structure. I gave him that. I moved him further inside the operation over the past 3 years than he'd been in the previous 8. And it wasn't enough. His voice was stripped down to factual. The emotion bled out of it into something that wasn't quite cold. I think it was never going to be enough, because what Silas actually wants isn't influence. It's, he paused, looking for the word. He wants to be the man who matters. The man everyone in the room is actually waiting to hear from, and I was always going to be in front of him. He resents you. He reveres me, Nico said. That's the problem. He's been revering me for 11 years, and the reverence curdled a long time ago into something else. And I didn't see it because I was looking at the performance, not what was underneath it. She thought about Silas's voice in the ventilation shaft, the stripped-down quality of it, the hardness that the polished respect had been covering. The voice of a man who had been standing behind someone else for over a decade and had finally run out of patience for it. Marco, she said. He's different. Marco is simple, Nico said. Not dismissively, pragmatically. Marco wants money and autonomy. He's been Silas's instrument in this, not his partner. Silas pointed him at me, and Marco didn't ask hard questions because the reward structure was favorable. That's useful, she said. Why? Because instruments can be separated from the hands that hold them. If Marco understands that Silas's plan has failed, his incentive to remain loyal to Silas evaporates. Nico looked at her. You want to turn Marco? I want to create options, she said. Marco, as a turned asset, is worth more to us alive and compliant than as an enemy in the field. He was quiet for a moment. You keep saying us. Do you object? The question sat between them. She watched him consider it, not performing consideration, but actually working through what the answer was. The same way he'd stood in the kitchen and thought about the Bianchi analysis before responding. A man who didn't reach for default answers. No, he said finally, quietly. She nodded once and looked back at her phone, and she told herself firmly, and for the second time that night, that the small shift in her chest was not relevant to current operational priorities. She was less convincing this time. At midnight, her contractor delivered the drive from the estate. She had the equipment set up within 20 minutes and was running the New York registration trail within 30. Nico sat across the room on a phone call in a voice too low to carry, coordinating with the 3 men he trusted. And she worked and he worked, and the Pilsen safe house hummed with the particular focused energy of 2 people who were both, in different ways, very good at the same thing, surviving. At 2 a.m, she had the name. She stared at it on the screen for a moment before she said, Nico. He crossed the room and looked at the screen over her shoulder. He went very still. You know him, she said. Dominic Carbone. The name came out of him with a specific weight. Not surprise, something worse than surprise. Recognition of a thing you had expected somewhere in the back of your mind and had not wanted to confirm. He's the head of the New York families, yes. She pulled up the secondary documentation. The account connections are clean. I can put him directly in the financial chain supporting the weapons procurement. He's been Silas's backer from the beginning. Dominic Carbone has been the patriarch of the New York operation for 30 years, Nico said. He doesn't make moves like this. He's too established, He's aging, she said. His operation has been losing ground to newer structures for the past 4 years. His revenue is down and his alliances are straining. She pulled up the financial profile she'd compiled. Chicago under Silas, with a debt to New York for the backing, would give him a tributary operation at exactly the moment when his own empire needs the support. Nico straightened up. He moved away from the table, not pacing. He wasn't a pacer, she'd already noted that, but creating distance the way people did when a thought was too large to contain in a small space. He was at my wedding, he said. She turned around to look at him. Dominic Carbone was at my wedding, he said again, and the quality of the statement was specific. A man placing himself back in that cathedral, reinterpreting everything he'd seen there through the lens of what he now understood. He sat in the 6th row. He shook my hand at the reception. He told me he stopped. She waited. He told me I deserved a woman with more fire, Nico said quietly. He said it like a joke. The empty pew. The reserved, marked, conspicuously vacant space she'd noted during the ceremony and filed for later. Not Carbone's seat. She'd seen him seated elsewhere. Someone who had been expected and hadn't arrived. Who was expected to sit in the middle right pew, she said. 3rd row back. The one that was marked and empty. He looked at her. The expression shifted. A fractional change that she had learned over 34 days to read with some accuracy. This one meant something she didn't have a label for, something more personal than operational. Elena's mother, he said. She was invited out of courtesy. She didn't come. Elena again. She had been going to leave it alone. She had decided multiple times to leave it alone. Nico, she said carefully. The accident, Elena's accident. There were inconsistencies in the public record that I... Don't! His voice sharp and flat and absolute. She stopped. Not tonight, he said, and his voice had changed entirely. The tactical control stripped away, something beneath it that was genuine and raw and off limits. Whatever you found, whatever you think you know about that, not tonight. Okay, she said. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face that she did not catalog, did not file, did not analyze. She let it exist without processing it. He turned away. They worked until 4 a.m. without speaking beyond operational necessity. She compiled the full evidence file, all of it, clean and sequential, and documented to a standard that would withstand scrutiny, the kind of file her father would have built when he'd been at his best. Nico coordinated the movement of his 3 trusted men to positions she'd suggested based on her read of Silas's likely response to the night's failure. At 4:15, her phone buzzed. She read the message. Twice. Because the first time didn't make complete sense, and she needed the second pass to confirm she'd understood it correctly. She looked up. Nico. He crossed to her in 3 steps. She held up the phone. The message read, Marco DeLuca is at the 26th precinct. Turned himself in 40 minutes ago. He's asking for a deal. He's saying he has evidence on the Valenti organization going back 6 years. Nico read it. Read it again. That's not possible, he said. Marco wouldn't. Silas burned him, she said. Something happened tonight, after Meridian, when the plan failed. Silas burned Marco to protect his own exit. Marco found out and he ran to the only protection he could think of. The police. Nico said it the way you'd say a word in a language you didn't fully trust. He's not loyal to Silas anymore, she said, which means everything Marco knows about the evidence Silas has been building against the Valenti operation. Because there is evidence, I promise you there is, Silas is too careful not to have built a file. That evidence is now in the hands of people who will use it in a direction Silas cannot control. Nico put his hands flat on the table, and he looked down at them for a moment with the expression of a man who is calculating something with absolute precision and does not like what the calculation produces. If Marco is talking, he said slowly, and if Silas has the kind of financial trail I think he has on my operation, then by morning, the exposure risk is significant, she said. Yes. How significant? She looked at the file on her screen. She thought about the weapons chain. She thought about Carbone in New York. She thought about Marco sitting in the 26th precinct right now, talking to people who would be very, very interested in everything he had to say. Significant enough, she said, that everything changes in the next 12 hours. He looked at her. We can't just stop Silas anymore, she said. We have to destroy him. Completely. Financially, operationally, every piece of infrastructure he's built. All of it has to come down before Marco's testimony can be used as leverage. Or you lose control of the narrative and Silas walks away from the wreckage clean while you go down for everything he built. The sentence finished itself in the silence of the Pilsen safe house and sat there like something physical, like a wall that had just appeared between where they were standing and every exit they'd been calculating. Nico lifted his hands off the table. He straightened up. She watched him do it. The specific quality of a man pulling himself back into operational posture through sheer will, setting aside the weight of the past 4 hours, the way you'd set aside something you couldn't carry and couldn't put down and had to find a third option for. The financial records you compiled, he said. The full file. How quickly can you weaponize it? Against Silas specifically? I already have enough to destroy the shell infrastructure and freeze the procurement accounts. If I move on all of it simultaneously, every account, every entity, every transfer point, he loses the financial foundation before he can redirect assets. She paused. But if Marco is already talking, we have a timing problem. The moment his testimony gives investigators a thread to pull, they'll start pulling, and some of those threads lead to accounts that are connected to both Silas and to you. How connected? Legitimately connected, she said carefully. The Valenti operation structure overlaps with some of the shell infrastructure Silas used because he built it using your existing frameworks. From the outside, the contamination looks intentional. He looked at her steadily. Meaning it looks like I knew. Meaning it could be read that way by someone who wants to read it that way. She held his gaze. Which Silas absolutely does. He moved to the window, not close enough to be visible from the street, just enough to change the angle of his body relative to the room, the way people did when a thought needed physical space. She gave him 30 seconds. There's a man, he said, a federal contact, prosecutorial side, not investigative. He's been an arrangement for several years. He has discretion and he has motive to keep the Valenti organization's exposure limited because his exposure is connected to ours. You're talking about a compromised prosecutor, she said. I'm talking about a man who has a significant personal interest in controlling what Marco's testimony produces. He turned from the window. If I can get to him before the detectives at the 26th build momentum with Marco's statement, I can shape the narrative, redirect the focus towards Silas and away from the organizational structure. She ran the logic. It held, but it had a critical vulnerability. If that contact has already heard from Silas tonight, then he's been told I'm dead, Nico said, and his calculation of where his interests lie has shifted. Exactly. Another silence. This one was working silence. Both of them simultaneously processing the same problem from different angles, and she was aware of how strange that was, how specific and unusual it was to be in a room with someone whose mind moved at a compatible speed and direction. And she was aware that she was noticing it, and she filed that awareness in the place where she kept things she was not going to examine right now. Call him, she said. The contact. Let him know you're alive before Silas consolidates his version of events. That resets his calculus. Nico picked up the secondary phone. He dialed. 3 rings, 4, and then a voice, rough with interrupted sleep and with something underneath the sleep that was closer to fear. It's me, Nico said. The voice on the other end said something she couldn't hear. Nico's expression didn't change, but his grip on the phone shifted fractionally. I'm aware of what you heard, he said. I'm telling you what's accurate. A pause. Marco DeLuca is at the 26th. Whatever he's saying, I need you to understand that the financial trail he's describing was built by Silas Vescovi as a frame. I have documentation. He glanced at Delilah. Substantial documentation, enough to redirect any serious inquiry. Another pause, longer. His jaw tightened. I understand your concern. I need 24 hours. The voice again. I'm not asking for a favor. I'm telling you how this ends for both of us. If you don't... He stopped. She watched his face. Whatever the voice said in that moment did something to his expression she hadn't seen before. Not shock, because Nico Valenti had trained shock out of himself a long time ago. Something more internal. A door closing. I see, he said, quiet, flat. Thank you for telling me. He ended the call. She waited. Silas got to him 3 hours ago, he said, before Meridian. He made contact before the assassination attempt, which means he wasn't operating on the assumption that the attempt would succeed tonight. He was building the post-Nico landscape in parallel with the kill plan. She absorbed that. He called the prosecutor before he tried to have you killed. He called the prosecutor before he tried to have me killed, Nico confirmed, which means the frame was already in place. The financial contamination evidence, the testimony infrastructure. It was already delivered. My prosecutor contact has already made a decision about where his interests lie. He chose Silas. He chose survival, Nico said, with the particular tone of a man who has had enough experience with betrayal to have stopped finding it surprising, but has not yet stopped finding it ugly. Which is its own kind of answer. She turned back to her screen. She was thinking rapidly, remapping the operational landscape with the new information. Every path she'd calculated in the past 2 hours was now running through a compromised node, which meant the timing advantage she'd been counting on was gone, which meant Delilah. She looked up. He said her name so rarely that the sound of it was slightly disorienting. There's something else, he said. Something you said before, about Elena. Her hand stilled on the keyboard. The inconsistencies in the record, he said. His voice was controlled, but it was the control of a man maintaining something at significant effort. Tell me what you found. She looked at him. She thought about telling him later when they had more time, when the immediate operational pressure was lower. She thought about what it meant that he was asking now, in the middle of this, after the night they'd had. She thought about the particular weight she'd heard in his voice the first time Elena's name had been spoken in the cathedral, collected by 100 people with quiet reverence. 7 sources, she said, all reporting on the accident. None of them agree on 3 specific details: the time of the call to emergency services, the direction of the impact on the vehicle, and the weather conditions at the reported location. The ice storm was real, he said. I was in that city the same night. I know what the weather was. The weather at the accident location, she said carefully, is inconsistent with the storm pattern that evening. The recorded impact vector on the vehicle is inconsistent with a slide-out on the type of road where it was found. She paused. The call to emergency services came from a number that was registered to a prepaid account purchased 6 days before the accident. He was very still. Someone called it in, she said. Someone who knew to call it in, which means someone knew the accident was going to happen. The stillness had a different quality now. Not the processing stillness she'd learned to read over 34 days. Something older. Something that had been sitting in him for 4 years, unreachable, in the part of a person that knows something and refuses to know it simultaneously. Silas, he said. Not a question. The prepaid account, she said. I traced the purchase point. It was bought at a convenience store on Michigan Avenue. The store's security system retained footage for 90 days before it was overwritten, which means I can't pull the image. She looked at him steadily. But the store is 4 blocks from the building where Silas Vescovi's secondary residence is registered. The silence that followed was the longest one yet. She watched him. She watched the specific, terrible process of a man understanding something that reorganized 4 years of grief and guilt and unanswered questions into a shape he had not been able to see before. She watched him hold it, hold it, hold it, the way you held something that burned. Then something happened to his face that she had no category for and did not try to create one. She looked back at her screen and gave him the privacy of her averted eyes. He didn't speak for 2 full minutes. When he did, his voice was different, stripped of everything performative. She found something, he said. Elena, 6 months before the accident. I know she found something. She told me she was worried about a discrepancy in the accounts. I told her to let it go. His voice did not break. It was more disturbing than if it had. I told her it wasn't her concern. Delilah said nothing. She didn't let it go, he said. She never let anything go. Nico. She went to Silas, he said. That's what she would have done. She trusted him. Everybody trusted him. The last sentence had something in it that was not grief and not fury, something that lived in the space between them where they became one feeling. She went to Silas with whatever she found, and he decided she was a problem. I can build the evidentiary chain, she said quietly. It will take time, but the financial records from that period, if Elena found a discrepancy, there will be a trace of what she found. And if I can reconstruct what she found, I can connect Silas to the decision to remove her. Do it, he said. Whatever else happens. Whatever else we do tonight. You build that file. I will. He turned away from her. He stood facing the wall of the Pilson's safe house in the early morning dark, and she let him stand there, and she went back to work, and neither of them acknowledged the shift in the room's gravity because some things didn't need to be named to be real. She had been running the account deconstruction for 40 minutes when the first alert came through. Not her phone. The monitoring software she'd deployed on the estate's network, a passive alert she'd configured to flag specific activity patterns. Someone was accessing the East Wing. She pulled the feed. 2 men. She didn't recognize either of them, which meant they weren't estate staff and they weren't regular security. They were in her sitting room. They were methodical, professional. They were not looking for valuables. They were looking for exactly what she'd already removed. Nico. She turned the screen toward him. Silas sent a sweep team to the estate. They're in my rooms. He crossed to her in 2 steps. He looked at the feed. They're looking for your equipment, or for evidence of what I was doing. Either way, she stopped. One of the figures on the screen had paused. He was standing in front of the vanity. He opened the 3rd drawer. He reached into the back of it, into the exact space where the drive had been until her contractor had retrieved it 8 hours ago. He pulled out something small. She felt a cold drop in her stomach. That's not the drive, she said. I have the drive. Then what is it? Nico said. She stared at the screen. The figure held the object up and she could see it now. Small, flat, rectangular. Not her equipment. Something that had been in that drawer before she'd ever opened it. Something that had been placed there by someone who had known she'd be using that room. That was already there, she said slowly. In the drawer, before I arrived. What is it? What is... She knew what it was. She knew the profile and the dimensions and the specific category of device it belonged to from her father's descriptions of federal surveillance equipment. She knew because she had spent 3 decades accumulating knowledge about the tools of the operational world she'd been born adjacent to. It's a recording device, she said. Passive. Activated by ambient sound. Range of approximately 30 feet. She looked at Nico. It was placed in the East Wing before we arrived. Someone wanted to record whatever happened in those rooms. The implications arranged themselves with brutal clarity. Every phone call she'd made in that room, every conversation with Nico during his brief visits, the 4-hour window on day 34 when she'd been working through the account deconstruction and had spoken her reasoning out loud, a habit she'd developed from her father, who had always narrated his analysis because hearing it helped him find errors. She had done that, in that room, with a recording device in the vanity drawer. How much did it capture? Nico said. Everything, she said. Every call, everything I said out loud while I was working. She thought about what she'd said, the specific account names she'd narrated, the shell entity structures, the New York connection, the weapons chain. Silas has the complete picture of what I found. He's known for, I don't know how long, I don't know when they started pulling from the device. She stopped herself, breathed. She looked at Nico and said the things she didn't want to say. He knew I was building the file. He's known for long enough to have prepared for it. Nico's expression was completely unreadable. The evidence I compiled, she said. He already knows what it contains, which means he's had time to... Her monitoring software threw a second alert. She looked at the screen. It was not the estate feed. It was the alert she'd configured on the Valenti organization's primary financial network. The one she'd set to flag any unusual transaction activity. The transactions running across the screen were not unusual, they were catastrophic. Every account she'd identified in her deconstruction was moving, simultaneously. The shell entities were liquidating, the transfer points were redirecting, the procurement chain was dismantling itself in real time, a controlled demolition of a financial infrastructure by someone who knew exactly where every component was. Because Silas had listened to her find every component. He's pulling the money, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that and furious at herself for being proud of it, when the actual content of what she was saying was this. He's moving everything, right now. The 11 million, the weapons procurement accounts, the New York channel, all of it. He's heard my entire analysis, and he's been one step ahead of me, and he is collapsing the evidence trail while Marco is in that police station giving testimony that points directly at the accounts I can no longer... The monitoring software threw a third alert. This one she stared at for 3 full seconds before she believed it. The alert was from a flag she'd set on public records databases. Specifically, on filings related to the corporate entities she'd used to build her own operational infrastructure. The ones connected to the Pilsen safe house. The ones that, 4 hours ago, she had been absolutely certain were clean and untraceable. Someone had filed a records request on 2 of those entities at 4:47 in the morning. Someone who knew exactly what to look for. He knows where we are, she said. Nico was already moving. He crossed to the window, this time fully, pressing against the wall beside it and looking down at the street in the practiced way of a man who has spent his life understanding sight lines. Black sedan, he said. North side of the street. Parked 20 minutes ago. Engine still warm. You can see the exhaust. She was already closing her equipment, pulling the drive, shutting down the terminal in the sequence that would wipe the session without destroying the data. How did he find the entities, Nico said. Not asking her. Asking the situation, asking the logic of it. She knew the answer, and it landed in her like something breaking. The recording device, she said. Day 20. I was running a security audit on my own infrastructure, out loud. I narrated 3 of the entity registration numbers to check them against a cross-reference. She closed her eyes for 1 second. 1. He had the registration numbers. He's been sitting on them, waiting for me to build the complete picture so he could take it. He used you, Nico said. He let me do the work, and then he took it, she said. Yes. She had the bag packed in 90 seconds. Her hands were not shaking. She was operating on the razor-thin edge of controlled fury, the kind that made everything very clear and very fast and very dangerous, the kind her father had described once as the best and worst state a person could work from. Because the clarity was real, but the danger was that the fury wanted to move faster than the clarity could manage. Back exit, she said. There's a team at the back, Nico said from the window. I can see the positioning. How many? 3, possibly 4. She looked at the room. She looked at him. She thought about the Meridian building and the loading door and the armored SUV, and she thought about the fact that she did not have any of those things right now. No vehicle prepped, no contractor on standby, no prepared escape route, because the prepared escape route had been in her compromised infrastructure, and Silas had let her build it so he could take it away. She had been played. The woman who was supposed to be furniture had been turned into a tool, the most sophisticated tool in the operation, pointing directly at the target. And Silas had picked her up and aimed her and used her, and was now, at 5 in the morning in a building in Pilsen, preparing to close the hand around both her and the man she had spent 34 days trying to save. Nico turned from the window. He looked at her with complete directness and said, "Tell me you have something." She met his eyes. She thought about everything she'd built. Every layer, every redundancy, every contingency measure she'd told him existed when he'd asked if there was anything else he didn't know. The things she'd said were not relevant to the current situation. She thought about the files she'd been quietly building on Elena Valenti. Not the accident, the 6 months before the accident. The discrepancy Elena had found. The trail that Delilah had been following in parallel with everything else, on a completely separate device, using a completely separate methodology, narrated to no one, documented nowhere that a recording device in a vanity drawer could reach. The trail that she had not yet told Nico about. The trail that Silas did not know existed. She reached into the inner pocket of her jacket. She removed a second drive. Smaller than the first, matte gray, the kind of unremarkable object that didn't register as significant to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. She held it up between 2 fingers. "I have one thing," she said. "One thing he doesn't know about." Nico looked at the drive. He looked at her face. "It's Elena's file," she said. "The full trail from 6 months before the accident, and there's something on it that goes further than Silas." She felt her voice flatten as she said it. The flatness of someone delivering news they have been carrying alone and have not wanted to deliver. Something that goes further back than the coup plan, further back than anything I showed you tonight. He didn't move. "The weapons procurement chain," she said. "The New York connection. The way the shell infrastructure was built. She looked at him steadily because she owed him that, at minimum. Nico. Some of it started before Silas, before Marco, before the coup plan was ever conceived. The silence was absolute. Elena found it 6 months before she died, she said. And the person who had the most to lose from what she found wasn't Silas. The name she didn't say yet hung in the air between them like smoke, and Nico's face had gone the specific blank of a man whose mind has just hit something it cannot immediately process and is running hard against the edges of it. Outside, the black sedan hadn't moved. She could see its exhaust still threading upward in the cold. 3 men at the back. Whatever team Silas had positioned at the front would be moving to a closer hold soon. Men in static surveillance didn't stay static indefinitely, and whoever was commanding the exterior perimeter would give a move order within minutes. She did not have minutes to stand here and watch Nico absorb what she'd just said. "We go now," she said. "I tell you the rest when we're out. Tell me the name first." Nico. The name. Not a request, not quite a command. The voice of a man who has reached the outermost limit of what he can hold without knowing the thing he's been handed. "Tell me who Elena found." She looked at him. She made the calculation in the 2 seconds she had available for it. "Carbone," she said. It wasn't just a New York backing operation. Dominic Carbone has been running a financial extraction channel through the Valenti infrastructure for 9 years. Before the coup plan, before Silas moved against you, Elena found the earliest layer of it, and Silas found out she found it, and Carbone made a decision. She watched his face. Silas didn't originate the plan to kill your wife. He was given an instruction, and he followed it. The silence lasted 4 seconds. Then Nico moved. Not toward her, not toward the window. He moved to the small table in the corner where his jacket was folded, and he reached into the interior pocket and removed a compact semi-automatic that she had known he was carrying since the parking structure and had not mentioned because it was not her information to manage. He checked the chamber. His hands were completely steady. His face was the face of a man who has stepped through something and come out on the other side of it into a place where the normal calculations no longer apply. "Back exit," he said. "There are 3 men. I know." She looked at him for 1 more second. Then she picked up her bag and followed him. The stairwell was narrow and dark and smelled of old concrete, and she moved behind him with the drive in her jacket pocket and her mind running the variables at full speed. 3 men at the back exit. Positioned for a containment hold, not a direct assault. Silas wanted them alive, probably. At least long enough to recover whatever operational intelligence Delilah carried. Dead targets didn't answer questions, and Silas was a man who needed answers before he closed files. That was the only leverage they had in the next 30 seconds. Nico stopped at the ground floor door. He listened. She listened beside him. 2 people in a stairwell in the dark, breathing very quietly, and she was aware of his shoulder 6 inches from hers and the warmth of him and the specific quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of hesitation, but the stillness of a predator holding position. And she thought, "I have spent 34 days thinking of this man as a target and a problem and a variable. And I am only now understanding what it means that he is also, in his particular and terrible way, very good at this." He held up 2 fingers, pointed left. She understood. She went right. The back exit opened onto a service alley that ran between their building and the one behind it, and the 3 men were positioned exactly where the camera feed had shown her. One at the alley's north end, one at the south, one covering the exit door itself. The one covering the exit door was the problem. He had 4 seconds to respond to the door opening before Nico was through it, and in those 4 seconds, everything either worked or didn't. She had no weapon, no vehicle, no prepared distraction, nothing except the contents of her bag and the particular quality of a woman who looked like furniture moving through a space and not registering as a threat until it was too late to recalibrate. She went first. She pushed through the door before Nico could position to do it himself. And she came out into the alley with her bag over her shoulder and her glasses on, and her expression carefully composed into the specific blankness of a woman who is cold and tired and has somewhere to be and is not, in any reading of her body language, a person who is fleeing a surveillance operation. The man at the door looked at her. She looked back at him with the pleasant, unfocused gaze of a civilian and said, "Excuse me," and moved past him, and he was still recalibrating. The 2-second delay of a man whose pattern recognition is running against an unexpected input. When Nico came through the door behind her and the delay became a problem that resolved itself with a speed and efficiency. She did not watch because she was already moving north toward the end of the alley where the second man was bringing up his position, and she needed all of her attention on what was in front of her. She had 7 seconds. She counted them. She reached into her bag with her right hand. At 4 seconds, the man at the north end of the alley made his decision. He moved toward her, right hand coming up, his mouth opening to say something. She threw the bag at his face, not as a weapon, as a distraction, a half-second interruption of his focus, and in that half-second she was inside his reach and her elbow connected with his forearm in a specific way that her field medic in that other city, in that other chapter of her life, had shown her once in a warehouse very similar to this one, and the gun in his hand became briefly not his problem, and then became more permanently not his problem, when Nico arrived from behind her and converted the situation into something final. She picked up her bag. She did not look at the man on the ground. "South," Nico said. They ran. The sedan at the front of the building was already moving. She could hear the engine note change as they cleared the alley's south end and hit the street, and she had 2 seconds to make a decision about direction before the vehicle rounded the corner, and she chose left, away from the main road, into the residential grid where the streets were narrower and the angles were worse for pursuit. Nico matched her pace without comment. He was bleeding from his shoulder again. She could see the dark spread on his jacket from the night's original wound, reopened by the alley. He was running like the pain wasn't there, which meant it was there, and he'd made a decision about it. 3 blocks. 4. She ducked them into the gap between 2 parked delivery trucks, and they pressed against the cold metal, and she heard the sedan pass the street entrance 2 seconds later without slowing. Both of them breathing hard now. Not ragged, controlled, the breathing of people who were tired and managing it. She could feel her heartbeat in her jaw, in her fingertips. The gray drive in her pocket felt enormous, heavier than its actual weight. "How far does it go?" Nico said, low, between exhales. "Carbone, in the financial structure. 9 years of extraction," she said. "Small percentages, consistent, distributed across enough transaction types that the aggregate wasn't visible unless you were looking at the complete picture over the full period." She steadied her breathing. Elena found 2 years of it. She didn't have the complete picture. She couldn't have from inside the operation without the forensic methodology. But 2 years was enough. Enough for Carbone to decide she was a liability. Enough for Carbone to instruct Silas to resolve it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him working through it. The timeline, the implications, the specific horror of understanding that the man he'd been planning to confront tonight had been, for 9 years, the instrument of someone else's agenda. That Silas's betrayal had roots that predated the coup plan, predated the weapons procurement, predated almost everything Nico had been told was the beginning of the problem. "He came to my wedding," Nico said, very quietly. "Carbone. He came to my wedding and he shook my hand and my wife was dead because of his decision, and he shook my hand and told me I deserved a woman with more fire." She said nothing. There was nothing to say to that. "He knew what you were doing," Nico said. "Before last night. He knew you were building the file. Through the recording device, yes, which means Silas was feeding him the intelligence in real time. Carbone has known for at least 2 weeks that I was reconstructing the 9-year extraction channel." Why didn't he move sooner? She had thought about this. Because the file wasn't complete yet. He needed to know how much I had, how far the reconstruction went. Killing us before I finished building it left the possibility that I'd passed partial documentation to someone else. Waiting until the file was complete and then taking it meant he got everything and eliminated the source simultaneously. She paused. He was using us as a completion mechanism. He let me finish his evidence gathering for him. Nico made a short sound, not a laugh. "And the drive you're holding?" "Has the one piece Silas didn't know about?" she said. "The Elena trail. Reconstructed from a separate methodology, on a separate device, narrated to no one." She looked at him. "It's the piece that connects Carbone directly to the instruction, not just the financial extraction. The decision, the order. Can you prove it?" "I can build the case," she said. "Given access to the right systems, given time." She held his eyes. "Given the meeting." "What meeting?" "The meeting that's going to happen today," she said. "The one Silas is currently arranging. He has the financial file. My complete reconstruction of the extraction channel and the coup infrastructure. He has Marco's testimony creating legal pressure on the Valenti operation. He has Carbone's backing. What he needs now is to formalize the transfer of power, to present the evidence file to enough of the right people that the transition becomes a fait accompli before anyone can organize resistance. Nico was very still. He'll call a meeting, she said. Today. Emergency session. He'll present it as a response to the crisis. Nico's death, the operational exposure, the need for immediate leadership continuity. He'll have the financial documentation ready as proof of your corruption. He'll have Carbone's representatives in the room to signal New York's endorsement. And he'll have enough of the city's political and criminal infrastructure present to make the transition stick. And if I walk into that meeting alive? Then he has a problem, she said, unless he's prepared for it. He'll be prepared for it, Nico said. Yes, she agreed. He will, which means walking in isn't enough. She reached into her jacket and held up the gray drive. We need to walk in with this, and we need to deploy it before he deploys what he took from me. He looked at the drive. He looked at her. You said given access to the right systems. Given time. We have neither. We have one of them, she said. I have a remote access protocol on the primary Valenti financial network, a back channel I built in the first week that wasn't part of the infrastructure Silas compromised. I can push the Elena documentation directly into the presentation layer from any terminal, format it to appear alongside whatever evidence Silas has prepared. She watched his expression. When he presents the financial file he took from me, I present Elena's file at the same time, in front of everyone, before he can control the room. You need a terminal in 20 minutes. I need a terminal in 12 minutes. He looked at her for a long moment. The alley was quiet around them. The city was beginning its early morning sounds, distant traffic, a dog somewhere, the particular texture of a Chicago winter dawn that was gray and relentless and indifferent to anything that had happened in it. I know where Silas will hold the meeting, he said. The Aldworth Club. Private. Members only. He's been laying groundwork there for 3 months. I can see that now, looking back. It's his controlled environment. He looked at his watch. He'll call it for noon at the earliest. He needs time to get the right people assembled, and he needs them rested enough to be persuadable. 7 hours, she said. 6.5. He looked at his shoulder. I need 20 minutes. We need a location. He pulled out the secondary phone, dialed. 2 rings and a voice. Male, awake, no sleep disruption. It's me. I need the Halstead address. 2 hours. A pause. Alone. Another pause. I know what I'm asking. Do it. He ended the call. He looked at her. Can you complete the Elena file in 6 hours? She thought about what she had on the drive, the reconstructed trail, the financial signatures, the connection between the instruction and the execution. She thought about the gaps. There were 2, small but present, places where the chain required inference rather than direct documentation. Inference was not proof. Inference was, however, in a room full of people who were already being presented with the destruction of everything they thought they understood, sometimes enough. I can make it sufficient, she said, if the room is what I think it'll be. Make it devastating, he said. They moved. The Halstead address was a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaning operation owned, she gathered, by one of Nico's 3 trusted men, a quiet, solid individual named Reyes, who met them at the side entrance without questions, looked at Nico's shoulder, said kitchen, and produced a medical kit that was considerably more comprehensive than the one in the armored SUV. Delilah sat up on the kitchen table while Reyes worked on Nico's shoulder with the efficiency of someone who had done this before and had decided some time ago to stop having feelings about it. She had the terminal running and the remote access protocol open in 4 minutes, and she was inside the Valenti Financial Network's presentation layer in 7. She worked. She did not look up when Nico made a short sound at something Reyes did with the wound. She did not look up when the 2 men spoke quietly at the other end of the kitchen. She built the Elena file with the focused, undecorated precision her father had given her. Not the precision of someone trying to impress, but the precision of someone who understood that a single weak link in a chain of evidence was an invitation, and that the people in that room at the Aldworth Club would be looking for invitations because the evidence she was presenting made them complicit in something they would want very much to disbelieve. She found the first gap and built a bridge across it using 3 cross-reference transaction records that established the timing correlation without requiring the direct link she didn't have. It held. It would hold under scrutiny from anyone who wasn't a forensic specialist, and Silas would not bring a forensic specialist to a meeting he intended to control. The second gap was harder. She sat with it for 18 minutes, turning it from different angles, and she found the solution in a piece of documentation she almost hadn't included, a property transfer record from 9 years ago that she'd flagged as peripheral and had nearly dropped from the reconstruction. It wasn't peripheral, it was the connection point. She rebuilt that section from the property record forward, and the chain was solid. She looked at what she had on the screen. It was enough. More than enough, if she was honest. Which she was, always, with herself, because self-deception was the luxury of people who could afford to be wrong. Done, she said. Nico was dressed, shoulder-wrapped, jacket on. Reyes had produced a clean shirt from somewhere. He looked, standing in that kitchen, like the man she'd seen at the altar, controlled, contained, entirely himself, except that something had changed in the composition of his face over the past 8 hours. Something she couldn't have named precisely, but that read, to the particular attention she'd been paying him as a man who has lost several things and is carrying them rather than setting them down. The other 2 men, she said, the ones you trust. We need them at the Aldworth. Already coordinated, he said. They'll be in position by 11. She stood up from this table. She was tired in a way that lived below the surface, the deep tissue fatigue of a person who had slept 3 hours in the past 2 days and had spent that time at a level of sustained cognitive intensity that borrowed against reserves she would have to pay back later. She was aware of it the way she was aware of the drive in her pocket and the wound on Nico's shoulder and the name Dominic Carbone sitting in the back of everything, as a condition that existed and had to be accounted for without being allowed to become an excuse. She looked at Nico. When we walk in, she said, you let me work before you engage Silas directly. Whatever he says. Whatever he does when he sees you, you give me 60 seconds to get into the presentation system before you respond to anything. 60 seconds is a long time in that room. I know what 60 seconds is, she said. Can you hold the room for 60 seconds without letting Silas control it? He looked at her with the expression she'd first seen at the altar, that appraising quality. Except that it had changed now, had acquired a layer she hadn't been able to read then because she hadn't had enough data. She had enough data now. He trusted her. Not completely. Not without the specific reservations of a man who trusted very little and had excellent reasons for that policy. But enough. The particular enough of a person who has watched someone perform under pressure and has updated their assessment and is willing to act on the update. 60 seconds, he said. They arrived at the Aldworth Club at 11:47. The building was a landmark, old money architecture, discreet entrance, the kind of place that didn't announce its own significance because its significance was assumed by everyone who mattered. 2 of Silas's men were at the exterior, and they saw Nico and the specific quality of their response, the fraction of a second where training competed with shock and training won but barely, told her everything about what state the room inside was already in. They were expected. Not alive, but expected. Nico walked through the entrance like a man who owned it, which he did, in the specific way that ownership was understood in the world he inhabited. She walked beside him, not behind, and she noticed the shift that produced in the men they passed, the recalibration, the rapid reassessment of the situation, the messages being sent behind eyes that were carefully not showing what was behind them. The meeting was in the Aldworth's private dining room. She could hear voices through the closed door. 20 people, maybe more. The particular acoustic signature of a room full of people who were listening to one person and performing attention. Silas's voice. She recognized it from the ventilation shaft. Nico's hand went to the door handle. 60 seconds, she said quietly. He looked at her once. He opened the door. The room stopped. 23 people. She counted without appearing to count, mapping the faces against the catalog she'd been building since the wedding. Politicians. 3 judges. 7 of the senior figures in Chicago's criminal infrastructure. 2 individuals she identified as Carbone's representatives. New York suits. The specific quality of men who were present as signals rather than participants. And Silas, standing at the head of the table with a presentation already running on the screen behind him. Her evidence file, her financial reconstruction, Her work, displayed as proof of Nico Valenti's corruption to a room full of people who were watching the door with the expressions of people who have just seen something they were told was impossible. Silas's face moved through 3 distinct phases in the span of 2 seconds. She cataloged them without looking directly at him. Shock. Rapid calculation. The specific settling of a man who has prepared for contingencies and is now selecting one. Nico, Silas said. His voice was very smooth. I'm glad you're alive. The room was absolutely silent. She moved. Not obviously. Not fast enough to read as running. She moved toward the side credenza where the room's AV system was connected. And she moved with the quality of a woman who belongs in a space. And the room's attention was on Nico and on Silas and on the specific crackling electricity of that confrontation. And she had 40 seconds left. I'm going to need everyone to sit down, Nico said, and his voice carried through the room with the specific authority of a man who has earned it rather than assumed it. What's on that screen isn't what you've been told it is. Nico. Silas stepping forward, both hands visible. The performance of reasonableness. I understand you're upset. The situation last night was, don't. I need you to hear me out. The documentation I've presented shows... It shows what she built, Nico said, and what you stole. 23 faces moving between them. She had 20 seconds. She connected the drive to the credenza terminal and opened the remote access protocol, and the 12-minute deployment clock started, and she started it manually and began running it at the maximum rate the system would sustain. The woman you brought in here, Silas said, and his voice had changed, dropping the reasonableness, the first fracture showing, is the daughter of a man who destroyed himself and took other people down with him. Whatever she's told you, whatever file she's... Silas. Nico's voice stopped him. Elena found it. The room temperature changed. Silas went very still. She found the extraction channel 9 years ago, Nico said. 2 years of it. She came to you because she trusted you. Behind her, Delilah heard the specific silence of a room in which everyone has just understood that the conversation they thought they were in is a different conversation entirely. She did not turn around. 8 minutes remaining. She kept her hands moving. I don't know what she... You made a call, Nico said. After she came to you, you made a call to New York. This is... Silas's voice had changed again. The smoothness was gone. Underneath it was the same voice she'd heard in the ventilation shaft, harder, older, stripped of the performance. This is not the place for this conversation. This is exactly the place, Nico said, because every person in this room has been told they're here to watch the transfer of power in Chicago. And what they're actually here to watch is the end of the man who murdered my wife. The room erupted. Not chaos. The specific eruption of 23 people suddenly and simultaneously recalculating their position in a situation that has just shifted beneath them. Voices overlapping, chairs moving. The 2 New York suits exchanging a look that she caught in her peripheral vision and read accurately as men deciding whether to stay or create distance from what was happening. 6 minutes. Silas moved, not toward Nico, toward her. She heard him rather than saw him, heard the specific speed of a man who has identified the actual threat in the room and is responding to it, and she turned from the credenza, and the drive was connected, and the protocol was running, and she had 6 minutes left, and Silas had covered half the distance between them, and his expression was the expression of a man who is past calculation and into response. He was fast. She had known he would be. A man who had been physically capable enough to run an organization like the Valenti Operations Enforcement Wing for 11 years did not get slow at 53. She stepped left and put the credenza between them and said, loudly and clearly, into the room. The Elena Valenti file is currently deploying to every screen in this building. It will be complete in 5 minutes and 40 seconds. It includes the financial signatures connecting Dominic Carbonen's extraction channel to the specific instruction issued in February 4 years ago. Anyone who would like to understand what they've been asked to endorse today should still be in this room when it finishes. Silas stopped. Not because of the words, because of the calculation behind them. The specific look of a man understanding that the woman he'd dismissed as furniture had just turned the room's attention into a weapon and pointed it directly at the thing he could not afford to have seen. She's lying, he said, to the room. Whatever she claims to have, 4 minutes, she said. There is no file. She's 3 minutes 50. Nico. Silas turned to him, and the voice had changed again. A third version, the deepest one, the one she hadn't heard before, and it had something in it that might, in a different life, have been the actual relationship between these two men before everything curdled. You don't want this. In front of these people. Whatever she's found, whatever she thinks she's found, we can handle it, the way we've always handled things, between us. Nico looked at him. 11 years, Silas said. 11 years, Nico, before she existed, before any of this. 11 years. The room was absolutely silent. Delilah looked at the screen. 2 minutes, 40 seconds. The Elena file was formatting into the presentation layer, line by line, the accumulated forensic weight of 9 years of careful theft and one decision made in winter about a woman who had found the wrong thing and trusted the wrong person with it. She looked at Nico. His face was the face of a man standing at the exact center of something that has no clean exit, only the choice of which direction the damage runs. She watched him look at Silas, and she watched 11 years pass across his face in the space of 4 seconds, and she watched him arrive at the other side of it and find it empty. She existed before you decided she didn't, Nico said. Silas's hand moved toward his jacket. The two men Nico had positioned at the room's perimeter moved faster. Silas stopped. 1 minute. She turned back to the screen and she watched the Elena file complete its deployment, and she thought about a woman she had never met who had found 2 years of a 9-year theft and had trusted the wrong man with it. And she thought about Thomas Mercer teaching a 14-year-old girl the language of hidden money at a kitchen table in a different city. And she thought about the drive in her pocket that had cost her 34 days of her life, and one marriage and approximately everything she'd believed about safe infrastructure. And she thought, 40 seconds. The screen behind Silas went white. Then it filled. The room made a sound, collective, involuntary, the sound of 23 people seeing something they cannot immediately metabolize. Names, dates, transfer records, the specific, undeniable architecture of a 9-year financial crime laid out in the clean, ruthless language of forensic documentation. And at the end of it, not a conclusion, not an editorial, just a record, the call log. February, 4 years ago. Silas Vescovi's number. A New York exchange. Duration, 4 minutes, 17 seconds. Timestamp 3 days before Elena Valenti's car went off the Eisenhower Expressway on a night when the ice storm hadn't reached that section of road yet. The room was silent. Silas was looking at the screen with the expression of a man watching something he spent 9 years building. The screen held its light. 23 people sat in the weight of it. The call log, the transfer records, the 9-year architecture of a theft and a murder laid out in the clean and different language of numbers, and the room did not move. It was the specific stillness of people who have been handed something they cannot return, who have seen something that has permanently altered the shape of what they believed they were part of, and who are now, each of them, separately and simultaneously, calculating what that alteration cost them personally. Silas stood at the head of the table with his hand still near his jacket, and Nico's two men still positioned at his margins, and he was looking at the screen with an expression she had not anticipated. Not fury, not the rapid calculation she'd expected. Something older than both of those. The expression of a man who has been carrying something for a very long time, and has just watched the carrying become unnecessary because the thing is finally, irrevocably, in the open air. He looked tired. She noticed that and filed it without knowing what to do with it. Silas Vescovi. One of the judges, a heavy-set man in his 60s named Carver, whose name she'd pulled from the wedding guest list and cross-referenced against 3 separate corruption inquiries, all of which had quietly dissolved, spoke from the middle of the table. His voice was the voice of a man who had made his career reading rooms. "I'd like you to explain what I'm looking at." Silas didn't answer. "The call log," Carver said. February. Elena Valenti died in March. Still nothing from Silas. He was looking at the screen, and the looking had the quality of a man reading something he already knew by heart. Which he did. He had always known exactly what he'd done. The documentation hadn't told him anything new, it had only told the room. "The money," said another voice. One of the Chicago infrastructure figures, a man named Tully, whose family had operated on the city's south side for 40 years. 9 years of it, running through the Valenti accounts. Where did it land? New York, Nico said. The two Carbone representatives stood up simultaneously. It was the specific movement of men executing a pre-planned exit, the kind of movement that had been decided before they'd walked into the room, a contingency for a scenario that had apparently been considered possible. They moved toward the door with the practiced deliberateness of men who were not running because running would be an admission and not running preserved a fiction they still needed. Reyes stepped into the doorway. The two men stopped. Nico looked at them from across the table. "Sit down," he said, quietly. The quietness was the most dangerous part of it. They sat down. The room had shifted completely now. The full weight of it, the understanding moving through the 23 people like current through water, reaching everyone at their own speed according to their own particular relationship with what had just been revealed. She watched it happen. She watched the politicians look at the judges, and the judges look at the infrastructure figures, and the infrastructure figures look at Silas, and she watched Silas look at Nico, and she watched the 11 years between them conduct their final reckoning in the space of a held breath. "I didn't want you dead," Silas said. His voice was the ventilation shaft voice, the real one, stripped of every layer of performance he'd been sustaining for over a decade. "I didn't want that," he said again, like saying it twice made it a different category of truth. "The Meridian Plan, that was never my first choice. You have to understand that I tried. For years I tried to find a version of this that didn't end there." "Elena," Nico said. A pause. "Elena was—" Silas stopped. His jaw worked briefly. "Carbone gave me an instruction. I told him I would handle it. I thought there was a way to manage it without—" He stopped again. "She wouldn't stop. I told her to stop, and she wouldn't. And Carbone's timeline was—" "Don't," Nico said. The word came out flat and final, a door closing. "Don't explain it to me. There is no version of that sentence I want to hear finished." Silas closed his mouth. The room was very quiet. "Marco DeLuca is at the 26th precinct," Delilah said, into the silence. Not loudly. Factually, the way she delivered all information, because information delivered with emotion acquired edges that cut the wrong things. "He has been speaking to investigators since approximately 4 this morning. His testimony, combined with the documentation currently on this screen, constitutes a complete account of the conspiracy against the Valenti organization and against Elena Valenti specifically." She looked around the room. "Everyone in this building is now in a position to make a choice about which side of that account they stand on. The choice will be made by investigators and by others, regardless of what anyone in this room decides. But the speed and the terms of how it's made can still be influenced by the decisions that happen in the next hour." She felt 23 pairs of eyes on her. She had spent her entire life being invisible in rooms like this. The plain, heavy, quiet woman in the corner who wasn't worth the attention. She stood in the full weight of those 23 pairs of eyes, and she did not adjust herself to make it easier for anyone, and she did not look away. "What she's telling you," Nico said, "is that the men who can make this easier for themselves are the ones who decide now." The room broke. Not dramatically. Not with shouting or overturned furniture. It broke the way rooms broke when the thing holding them together had been removed. Gradually, then completely, individuals separating from the collective into their own calculations, reaching for phones, speaking in low voices to the person beside them, making the specific series of micro-decisions that added up to a position. 3 of the politicians moved to separate themselves from Carbone's representatives within the first 4 minutes. One of the judges crossed the room to speak directly to Nico. 2 of the infrastructure figures approached Delilah, which surprised her. They addressed her directly, not Nico, with the particular quality of men who had recalibrated their read of the power structure in this room and were adjusting their approach accordingly. She answered their questions. She gave them specific, accurate information about what the documentation showed and what it didn't show, and what the realistic exposure scenarios were for individuals whose connection to the conspiracy was peripheral rather than central. She did this without warmth and without hostility, in the same register she'd used to discuss the Bianchi family's leverage position in a kitchen at 6 in the morning, because the register that worked was the one that treated information as real rather than as theater. Silas sat at the head of the table and did not move. She was aware of him the whole time, his stillness, the specific quality of it, A man who has reached a conclusion about his situation and has stopped performing for an audience that is no longer watching him. She was aware of it, and she monitored it, and she did not make the mistake of assuming that stillness meant passivity. It was Nico who went to him eventually. After the room had thinned, after the politicians and their separate vectors had cleared out, after the judges had made their respective calculations and departed, after Carbone's representatives had been escorted to a different kind of waiting by Reyes and the second of Nico's trusted men. After the room held only Silas and Nico and Delilah in the corner with her drive and two men at the door. Nico pulled out a chair and sat across from Silas at the long table. She stayed where she was. This was not her conversation. "You could have come to me," Nico said. "When Carbone first approached you, when he first built the channel, you could have told me." "I know," Silas said. "Why didn't you?" A long pause. Silas looked at his hands on the table. The hands of a man in his 50s, capable hands, the hands of someone who had built things and made decisions and lived with them. "Because I'd already benefited from it," he said. "By the time I understood the full structure of what Carbone had built, there was already money that had moved through accounts with my knowledge. Not my design, but my knowledge." He looked up. "I was already in it. And once you're in it, going to you meant confessing to being in it. And He stopped. "And you didn't want to see what I would do," Nico said. "I didn't want to lose what I had," Silas said. More quietly. More honest. That's the actual answer. Not fear of consequence. Fear of losing. The position, the work, you. He said the last word with the particular difficulty of a man who does not speak that way and is doing it anyway because there is nothing left to protect. 11 years of actually believing in what we were building. I didn't want to lose that, and I made a series of choices to avoid losing it, and each choice made the next one worse, and by the time Elena found the account, I was so far in that there was no clean exit anymore. Only forward. Nico was quiet for a moment. "She was kind to you," he said. "Elena. She trusted you specifically because you were mine." "I know," Silas said. The two words had a weight to them that she did not try to assess and did not look at directly. "That's the thing I can't—" Nico stopped. His voice had the specific quality of a man hitting the edge of what he can say out loud in front of witnesses. He adjusted. "That's the thing that doesn't have anywhere to go," he said. "Everything else, the money, the coup plan, all of it, those are problems. Problems have responses. But that—" He stopped again. Silas didn't say anything. They sat across from each other at the long table in the thinning light of the Aldworth Club's private dining room, and the 11 years sat between them like a country that had been destroyed and would not be rebuilt. "The investigators will want your cooperation," Nico said finally. "Full cooperation. Carbone's operation, the New York infrastructure, the weapons chain, everything you built, everything you know about how it was built. That's the conversation you're going to have. And in exchange," Silas said, "not asking for something, clarifying terms. In exchange, you're alive," Nico said. "That's the exchange. Don't dress it up." Silas nodded once. A small motion. The motion of a man accepting a sentence that is, under the circumstances, lighter than it might have been and heavier than anything he'd ever imagined carrying when he was building what he'd spent 11 years building. He looked across at Nico. "I'm sorry," he said. Nico stood up. He pushed the chair back in with a careful, deliberate movement, the kind of movement that was doing the work that words couldn't do. He looked at Silas for a moment. The full weight of the look, nothing performed about it. Then he walked to the door. She followed. In the corridor outside, he stopped. He stood with his back against the wall and his eyes closed for 3 seconds, and she stood a few feet away, and she watched him, and she did not say anything because some things were not helped by words, and were not meant to be. He opened his eyes. "Carbone," he said. "I know," she said. "The file we have on him, the 9-year extraction trail, the Elena connection, the New York infrastructure Silas is going to give us. Is it enough?" She thought about it honestly. "For a legal case, it will take time. The New York jurisdiction is complex, and Carbone has spent decades building insulation." She paused. "For the other families, it's already enough. The financial evidence shows he's been stealing from operations that believed they were in partnership with him. That's not a legal problem. That's a loyalty problem." And loyalty problems in New York, Nico said. Resolve themselves, she said. He looked at her. You'd present it to them, the other families. I'd present the documentation to anyone who has an interest in understanding how their partnership capital has been redirected for 9 years, she said. That's just information. What they do with it is their decision. Something moved in his expression that was not quite a smile and not quite grief, and lived in the specific intersection of the two that she had only begun to be able to read in the last 24 hours. You keep saying that you're just providing information, that decisions belong to other people. Information is what I have, she said. I don't have guns or armies. You drove an armored SUV through an industrial building wall. That was one time. The thing in his expression deepened. She felt something shift in her chest that she was going to continue to not examine for at least another 48 hours, or until she had slept for a minimum of 10 consecutive hours, whichever came first. Delilah, he said. I know we have things to discuss, she said. The operational structure going forward, the exposure management, the Carbone approach. That's not what I was going to say. She stopped. He looked at her with the directness she'd first encountered in the parking structure, the look of a man who has stopped calculating and started being honest, which was, she had come to understand, a significant departure from his default. I was going to say thank you, he said, and I was going to say that I understand what the past 34 days cost you, what you gave up to be, what you were, in that house, watching and waiting and not being seen. His voice was quiet and even and entirely without performance. I know what that costs, being invisible when you're not. She held his eyes. Thank you, he said. She stood in the corridor of the Aldworth Club in the same gray sweatshirt she'd been wearing since 4 a.m. in the Pilsen safe house, with the drive in her jacket pocket and the deep tissue fatigue in her bones, and the particular internal landscape of someone who has spent 34 days holding a great deal of weight alone and has just, in the past 8 hours, been seen holding it. You're welcome, she said. It was a simple thing to say. It was the right thing to say. She said it and meant it and left it there without adding anything to it. 3 weeks later, Dominic Carbone resigned from his position at the head of the New York families. The announcement was made through intermediaries, as these announcements always were, in language that spoke of health concerns and the wisdom of age and the desire for a peaceful conclusion to a long career. 3 of the 5 families had received, in the week prior to the announcement, a detailed financial analysis of their partnership capital's movement over the preceding 9 years. Clean, documented, forensically complete, delivered without commentary and without a named source, the way the most effective information always was. Carbone was not dead. That had been Nico's decision, and she had not argued with it, because it was his decision to make. And because a man who stepped down in public disgrace, stripped of allies and finances and the respect that had been the actual architecture of his power, inhabited a particular kind of living that was its own consequence. She thought her father would have appreciated that logic. She thought about her father more now than she had in years, not with the old anger, the anger she'd carried since she was 19 years old, and had watched him stand in front of a debt collector in the kitchen of their house, and had understood for the first time with adult clarity exactly what he'd done, and what it had cost, and what it would continue to cost. The anger had burned itself out somewhere in the past month, and what was left underneath it was more complicated and more honest. A man who had been brilliant and broken, and who had given her, in the ruins of everything else, the tools she'd used to do the things she'd just done. She sat at the desk in the room that had become her office. Not the East Wing sitting room, which she'd moved out of in the second week after the Aldworth, but the room adjacent to Nico's own office, the one with the south-facing windows that got real light in the afternoon. The door between the 2 offices was open. It was usually open now. She was building the final version of the organizational restructuring model, the framework for converting the Valenti operations financial infrastructure into something that was, if not entirely clean, then structurally insulated from the kind of penetration that had allowed Carbone's extraction channel to operate for 9 years. It was the most complex financial architecture she'd ever designed, and she had been working on it for 18 days, and it was almost right but not yet entirely right. And the not entirely right part was in the 3rd layer of the investment vehicle structure, and she had been circling it for 2 days. Nico appeared in the doorway between the offices. He looked at the screen over her shoulder for a moment. He had developed, over the past 3 weeks, the specific habit of reading her work without asking permission to read it, which she had decided she didn't object to, because the alternative was a version of the same invisible furniture arrangement she'd spent the first 34 days navigating, and she was not interested in returning to that. "The third layer," he said. "I know," she said. "The holding vehicle structure is creating a tax event that—" "I know," she said, and there was something in the repetition that made him stop. She looked up at him. "I know what the problem is. I've been working around it for 2 days. I need you to let me work around it for 2 more days, and then it will be solved." He held up both hands, a peace gesture, slightly ironic. 2 days, he said. 2 days. He crossed to the window instead of returning to his own office, and she turned back to her screen, and they occupied the same room in the particular easy silence that had developed between them over the past 3 weeks. Not comfortable in the sense of unchallenging, but comfortable in the sense of genuine. The way two people were comfortable when they had been through something together that stripped away every pretense and left only what was actually there. She had been thinking for 2 weeks about what was actually there. She had been thinking about it with the same methodical attention she gave to financial structures, which was probably not the right approach, but was the one she had available, and it had produced a picture that was complex and not entirely tidy, and that she had been unable to find a flaw in using any of her standard analytical frameworks. "Nico," she said. He turned from the window. "The night at the Pilsen safe house," she said, "when you said we could go. Not where can I go. We." He waited. "I want to know if that was operational or if it was something else," she said. The sentence was blunt and specific, and she delivered it the way she delivered information, directly, without softening, because softening changed the data and she needed the actual data. He looked at her for a moment. "It was something else," he said. She looked back at her screen. She sat with that for a few seconds, running it through the parts of herself that processed things, and she found that it settled rather than complicated, which was the answer to a question she had not known she was asking. "Okay," she said. He waited for more. "That's all I needed to know," she said. A pause. "That's it," he said. "Just okay." "I'm working," she said. "The third layer, 2 days." Another pause. Then the sound of him exhaling. The specific sound of a man who is managing something and finding, possibly for the first time in some years, that the managing is not unpleasant. He returned to his office. She heard the creak of his chair, the sound of him picking up his phone. The door stayed open. She turned back to the third layer and she found, in the specific settled quality of the room, the clarity she'd been missing for 2 days. It came the way solutions always came. Not through force, but through the right conditions for seeing, the removal of the noise that had been obscuring the signal. She could see the problem now with the precise focus that she'd been looking for. She could see exactly how to solve it. She started writing. The Chicago winter turned, the way Chicago winters eventually turned. Not gracefully, not with ceremony, but with the specific grudging capitulation of a city that endured rather than welcomed the change. March came in with gray skies and dirty snow, and then, about 2 weeks in, with light. Real light, the kind that hit the office's south-facing windows in the afternoon and sat on the desk like something earned. She was in the office on the afternoon the last piece of the Silas matter resolved. Her phone rang. The secure line, the one that she'd rebuilt after the Pilsen exposure, the one whose infrastructure she had designed herself methodically, without narrating a single step of the process to anyone or anything that could be recorded. She had learned from that. She answered and listened and said 2 words and ended the call. She sat for a moment with the phone in her hand. Silas Vescovi had entered federal custody that morning as part of a cooperation agreement that her financial documentation had made both possible and necessary. Possible because it gave prosecutors the complete evidentiary picture, necessary because it gave Silas no viable alternative. He would be useful to them for a long time. He would be somewhere controlled and distant, and the specific kind of contained that was as close to resolved as these things ever became. It was not a clean ending. She had stopped expecting clean endings somewhere around day 22 of her marriage, when she'd first seen the anomaly in the transfer timing and understood that the world she'd walked into was older and more layered than any clean ending could address. But it was an ending. She set the phone down. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked out at the city. The specific afternoon light on Chicago, the way it sat on the lake in the distance, the way the grid of the streets caught it and distributed it unevenly, some blocks bright and some in shadow, the whole thing alive and impersonal and continuing. She heard Nico's chair, his footsteps. He stopped in the doorway between the offices. "The call," he said. "Silas is in custody," she said. "This morning." He came to stand beside her at the window. Not close enough to be performative about it, close enough that it was real. They stood there and looked at the city for a moment. Two people who had come to this window from very different directions and by very different means, and who had ended up here, at this particular afternoon, in this particular light, after everything the past several months had cost. "She would have liked you," Nico said. "She didn't have to ask who. She had no patience for performance," he said. "She could see through it in about 30 seconds, and she didn't bother being polite about it once she had. Drove half the people in my world absolutely insane." A pause. The specific quality of a man remembering something he loves carefully, because the careful handling is what keeps it real. "She would have seen you at the altar and known immediately that you weren't what you appeared to be. And she would have come to find you that first week and asked you directly what you were doing. And I would have told her," Delilah said, and was surprised to find she meant it. "I would have told her everything." Nico looked at her. "She found the account trail in 6 months without my training," she said. "Without my methodology, just by paying attention." She looked out at the city. She deserved better protection than she got. "Yes," he said. "She did." They stood in the truth of that, not performing grief, not managing it, just letting it be what it was, which was real and permanent and part of the structure of everything that came after. The city below them continued its business. The lake in the distance was dark silver in the afternoon light. A container ship was moving along the horizon, slow and deliberate and enormous, carrying things from one place to another, which was what the world did regardless of what happened to the people who lived in it. "The restructuring model," she said. "It's done." He turned to look at her. "I finished the 3rd layer this morning," she said. "The holding vehicle structure is clean. The tax exposure is resolved." She paused. "I want to walk you through it." "Now," he said. "When you're ready." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "There's something I want to do first." She waited. He turned from the window to face her fully, and his expression was the one she still did not have a complete category for, the one she'd been building a category for since the parking structure, adding data points to it each time it appeared, and had arrived at something like the face of a man who has decided to stop being afraid of a particular thing. "I want to take you to dinner," he said, "somewhere that doesn't belong to me and isn't connected to any operation or any agenda, just dinner." She looked at him. "You can say no," he said. "I know I can," she said. He waited. "I'm not going to say no," she said. The expression completed itself. It was, she had the category for it now, finally, after everything. It was the face of a man who has arrived somewhere he didn't know he was going, and has found it better than anything he had planned. She recognized it because she understood, making the same expression, with whatever muscles she had that hadn't spent 41 years learning not to. She looked back out at the city. The light was changing, the afternoon sliding toward evening, the shadows lengthening across the grid, the lake going darker as the sky above it shifted. She thought about Thomas Mercer at a kitchen table, explaining the language of hidden money to a girl who was old enough to understand it and young enough to believe she'd never need to use it for this. She thought about the gown she'd worn to a wedding she hadn't chosen, and the thumbnail pressed into the index finger, and the 200 people who'd looked through her and the one empty pew, and the man at the altar who hadn't looked at her at all. She thought about 34 days of silence and patience and working in the dark, and the loading door of the Meridian building coming apart under an armored chassis, and a phone in a parking structure that had said "Silas knows you're alive" and changed the shape of everything. She thought about what it had cost and what it had built, which were in the end the same thing, AIM. Chicago spread out below them, alive and indifferent and entirely itself, the way cities were when they had been there long enough to outlast everything that happened inside them. The lake glittered in the last of the afternoon light. The streets ran their grid in all directions, carrying people and cargo and information and consequence, the way they always had, the way they would continue to. She turned from the window. "Let me get my coat," she said. He nodded. She crossed the office. At the door she stopped, her hand on the frame, and she looked back at him once, the man she'd married as a debt payment, standing in the light of the window she'd claimed, in the office that had opened between them, in the life that had been built from nothing and damage and the specific stubbornness of two people who were both, in their different ways, too difficult to break. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the city held its breath for a moment, the way cities did, the way everything did, in the second before what came next. Then she went to get her coat, and the lights of Chicago came on, one by one, in the early dark of an ending winter, and the empire that had been built on bullets was remade on something harder to destroy. And the woman who had been sold as a debt learned, finally and completely, the specific and irreplaceable value of what she'd been all along. Not furniture, not payment, not a bride delivered to settle accounts. A queen who had chosen her throne, fought for it, bled for it, and kept it. And the city, indifferent and enormous and entirely itself, received that truth the way it received all truth, without ceremony, without applause, as simply one more fact among the 10,000 facts of a winter finally releasing into spring.